I should be here now. All right. Welcome everyone. I'm going to wait a couple minutes for people to get into the stream and start seeing what's going on this week. Normally, when I start up, it's just a couple people, and then it takes a little bit for people to start showing up. Okay, so this week I am going to be talking about a topic that is, one of my favorite topics to talk about, and one of the things that really got me going down the research path that I am currently on. So while I wait for people to get here, I'll give a little bit of background on what I'm talking about and why I'm talking about this particular topic. So, as some of you might have seen, the first few videos that I did in the live were largely about metaethics and moral realism in particular. But, a lot of my interests have moved increasingly towards metaphilosophy. So, and it's sometimes called philosophy of philosophy. So this is basically questions about the nature of philosophy, how to do philosophy, what are the methods of philosophy, what different types of philosophy are. You basically ask philosophical questions about philosophy itself. And one of my concerns, and it's been, I'm saying this as though it's a recent tendency for me to move towards metaphilosophical questions, but an undercurrent of metaphilosophical concerns has always been there. And it's just that over the past few years, I've had this particular focus on metaethics and in particular, the psychology of metaethics. But the thing about that is it's the particular way in which I have engaged with the question central to metaethics. Some of you may know most of my research is actually in moral psychology and not moral philosophy. And there's a reason for that. So here's basically the kind of trajectory that I went on. I had started out studying philosophy and psychology. When I was deciding to go to grad school, I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to go. And I ended up studying philosophy. And then I moved over to psychology. Now, you might think that that was some sort of departure from philosophy and a move into psychology, but I never really stopped doing philosophy. And even while I was doing philosophy, I was always incorporating psychology into my work. Something that would happen in a lot of my classes is that instructors would sometimes say, look, this really looks like a too much a work of psychology and not enough philosophy. And the same kind of thing, but reversed, would happen when I would write papers for psychology courses. Sometimes they would be perceived as being a bit heavy on the philosophy, which, I can understand from an instructor's perspective. They want to make sure you're being on topic. But for me, the two have always been so deeply intertwined that it's hard for me to think of them as distinct disciplines that are autonomous and operate outside of one another. So, part of the reason for this is going to be what's I'm going to talk about today in the blog post that I wrote on this, which, sometimes my blog posts are a couple paragraphs, sometimes they're really long. This is a medium length one. It's a bit on the longer side. Might be a bit more concise. Sometimes I just go into these digressions, but this is one that had a specific purpose. And well, I'll get to that. See, I'm already digressing. So anyway, one of my concerns with a lot of the way that philosophy, especially I will often talk of contemporary analytic philosophy. So you might hear me say that a lot. Sometimes I'll just shorten it to, or I'll just say analytic philosophy. Sometimes I'll say contemporary analytic philosophy. I've seen people use the term contemporary analytic philosophy. I don't know that that's an especially technical term. What counts as contemporary? I'm not sure. We could say the past, few decades, maybe since the 1960s, since the 1980s, something like that. But analytic philosophy arose largely in the United States, the UK, kind of in the like some of the precursors to it were late 1800s, but a lot of it could be traced back right around to the turn of the 20th century, so right around 1900. I'm not a historian, so if there's certain milestones that you could place a decade or two before that, or a lot of things that might have come later, the linguistic turn and some sort of stuff that developments that occurred throughout the first half of the 20th century. Anyway, so analytic philosophy is this perspective on philosophy that emphasizes logic and language to a great extent. So a linguistic approach is very central to the analytic philosophical approach. And it's often associated with and grew out of these traditions in the United States, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. It's often distinguished from continental philosophy, meaning continental Europe, largely France and Germany, but like the continent, not the UK. So it's this specific approach to or perspective within Western philosophy that arose fairly recently. And one of the first points I'd make about that is, given that this particular, and that isn't to say that it is like emerged, like Athena from the head of Zeus, like it came out of nowhere or something like that. It is largely continuous with Western philosophical thought, going back all the way to like the pre-Socratics and Aristotle, Socrates, Plato. So it's a continuation of that, and on through Hellenistic philosophy and Aquinas and stuff like that. So it is continuous with that, and it is a development on that. But there were specific things that distinguish analytic philosophy, and a big part of it is this emphasis on language. A lot of things started happening in the 20th century where philosophy kind of, I guess you could say, like it really, I want to say matured in a way, but I don't really want to use that term, because although I think the contours of its methods sharpened, I think that they sharpened in a way that has been largely detrimental to philosophy. And so I don't want to say it matured, because I don't like where analytic philosophy has gone with its focus on language. As much as I love language, I think that there's a legacy of Christian theological influences and Platonic approaches that I think are really methodologically and conceptually suspect, that have, you could say infiltrated, but you could just say have persisted. They never really went away. So while contemporary analytic philosophy, most analytic philosophers are atheists, they're highly secular in their approach. Most of them will nominally endorse naturalism and regard philosophy as largely continuous with the natural sciences. There are substantial contingents, both of persistent, theistic beliefs, belief in the supernatural and the non-natural, that persist within philosophy. And, I think it's a good thing that it's not so dogmatic that, people are like, if you believe in God, get out. Like, I don't think that would be a good thing. But even when you have these secular or naturalistic approaches, a lot of them seem to me to be a kind of domesticated form of early mystical and theological views, that they sort of have tamed those views into some allegedly, supposedly naturalistic form that I still find highly suspect. So a lot of these like super non-reductive accounts strike me as seeking to retain precisely those elements that I think a kind of a hard-nosed empiricist approach would and should purge. You just get rid of them, and they never really went away. Anyway, so if you study philosophy, well, there's different approaches, but my experience of studying philosophy is largely within the analytic tradition. It's certainly possible I could have found my way into a continental philosophy or something else. But I ended up with analytic philosophy, and I became really concerned about what I took to be this really extensive appeal to intuitions. But right around the time that I was starting to study philosophy, this new movement arose. And there were sort of possibly some early precursor indications of it, but really it's only been maybe about 20 years. A lot of the work goes back to the early 2000s with Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch paper. There's another paper, Josh Knobe and the side effect or the Knobe effect. So a lot of this early research. So experimental philosophy was this movement that arose over the past 20 years or so, by and large, largely within the analytic tradition. And this approach basically employs basically empirical methods to assess traditionally philosophical questions, typically doing so by exploring the intuitions of non-philosophers. There's different terminology people use. Sometimes they call them the folk. I don't like that terminology. Sometimes they'll say ordinary people. I think if you say to people, oh yeah, I study ordinary people, that sounds strange. Like, what else are you going to study? Superheroes? Like what ordinary? What does that even mean? I don't think that's very helpful. So I prefer the term non-philosophers. I think that's sufficiently apt to describe the kind of population that experimental philosophers typically study. But really, experimental philosophy, you could try to define it in terms of its methods or the sorts of questions it addresses, but I don't think either of those would be apt, because there are psychologists that study moral psychology, for instance, or the formation of beliefs or something like that. You could call that, is that epistemology? So there are psychologists that will go, I've never heard of experimental philosophy. And yet they're addressing questions that are, adjacent or similar in some ways to the kinds of questions experimental philosophers address. And Knope has more recently written papers where basically say, look, experimental philosophy is just cognitive science. So I prefer to characterize experimental philosophy not as relying on a specific method or addressing a specific set of questions, but largely as a kind of social movement within philosophy, which basically, this sounds like a weird definition, but it's basically philosophers or people with substantial or predominantly philosophical training that have opted to employ empirical methods to continue addressing the sorts of questions they would otherwise have addressed without those methods. So it's basically philosophers getting empirical. That might be a contentious definition. I'm not saying that is the definition, but I think that's a reasonable way to think about it. That basically experimental philosophy is something that arose within philosophy, where some philosophers are like, look, some of the questions we might want to address are empirical. And that could be, and there's a few things that arose within experimental philosophy. Some experimental philosophers, there's sort of these like critical, I forget all the terminology people have proposed, but roughly, so here's what some experimental philosophers want to do. Here's what they do. They say, okay, so philosophers will say, I have the intuition that such and such. But then the experimental philosophers will say, okay, well, we went out and we did a survey, or we conducted a study, and it turns out that although philosophers seem to think that a particular view is intuitive, or it's the common sense view, or it seems plausible that, or whatever. Philosophers make a variety of claims. I should flag that and come back to that and talk to them about that a bit. Anyway, so if philosophers go around saying, and I'll just give it a familiar example, philosophers go around saying, yeah, moral realism is intuitive, seems true. We have good prima facie reason to believe moral realism is true in the absence of defeaters, yada, yada. So now you come along and you conduct a study, and suppose it turns out like 90% of non-philosophers, or the folk, or ordinary people, whatever terminology you want to use, don't find moral realism intuitive, and they actually find anti-realism intuitive. Well, that might raise some questions, and a few things it might do. Sometimes proponents of a particular philosophical perspective will claim that there's some sort of justification in virtue of the view being a commonsensical view, or it being the intuitive view, or it being the view that best accords with ordinary thinking or speaking. I could point to a tree and say, yeah, it seems to most people there are trees. If you're going to argue that there are no trees, we might say, okay, well, the rest of us, I don't really believe that there's any objective fact of the matter about who has the burden of proof. But if there was a person that was seriously arguing that there are no trees, or birds don't exist, or whatever, we might say, okay, well, we're not going to entertain that or take that very seriously as like a default starting point for any discussions we have. You want to show that there are no trees, the onus is on you. So if most people think a particular thing, you might think, okay, well, sure. Okay, well, let's go ahead and think that, unless we have some good reason to think otherwise. Now, if philosophers going around saying, I think this way, and I think this is the way other people think, if that figures into their presumptions about the plausibility of their views, but it turns out that most people don't think that way, that could provide some evidence against the view. It's not supposed to be decisive. Sometimes people have criticized experimental philosophy, and this might be true of some of the more, I guess you could say, exaggerated or overstated claims. It shouldn't be taken to be the view that we conduct a poll and then like philosophical truth is determined democratically. So if like more than 50% of participants favor one view over another, then the view is true provisionally or something. It might be that some papers are like, hey, we did a survey, 70% of people think compatibilism is true. So yeah, there you go. Compatibilism is probably true. That would be overstating what experimental philosophy is capable of, regardless of what early papers may or may not have said. They might have overstated the case. But it's not a matter of like whatever the majority view is among whoever the test population is, that view is correct. It shouldn't be used in that way. But it can raise questions about what philosophers are doing. And one of the early things it was used to do was to criticize philosophical appeals to intuitions by attempting to demonstrate a kind of unreliability of intuition. So some of this work purports to show that philosophical intuitions are subject to various biases, or they're subject to factors that on reflection we would think undermine the sort of epistemic credibility of the intuitions in question. So for instance, suppose you conduct a study, and I think there was a study like this. I don't remember exactly. I think they did find this, but I can't recall the precise details. But let's just take it as a hypothetical then. Okay, so imagine you conduct a study and you present people with both versions of the typical trolley problem, the switch case and the footbridge case. And it turns out that if you present people first with the switch case and then with the footbridge case, only like 30% of people think that you should, or it's morally permissible to push a person in the footbridge scenario. But if you flip them, it's like 60% think it's okay to push the person in the footbridge scenario. I think an actual study was done like this, and I think that they did find that people were, I don't know if they found that philosophers are subject to order effects, but that's the kind of evidence that could raise questions about the reliability of philosophical intuitions. If philosophical intuitions are subject to order effects, that is, if the order of the presentation of stimuli, such as different philosophical questions, influences one's response to those questions, if you're more likely to make a moral judgment, if I ask you two questions, A and B, and you're more likely to answer one way if I ask B first and a different way if I ask A first, that raises questions. And that seems to be an irrelevant factor. It shouldn't be that your response to the footbridge case should depend on whether I asked you about the switch case immediately beforehand or not. So that's the sort of thing that we might appeal to raise questions about the reliability of philosophical intuitions. So that's one thing experimental philosophers have used experimental philosophical findings to try to undermine intuitions as a source of evidence or as a methodological tool in the philosopher's toolkit. Others have tried to resolve or support claims about the degree to which a particular intuition is shared by non-philosophers or is part of like the common sense view. So that in some cases could actually be used to bolster or support the case for intuitions. You could also find in principle that some evidence that the intuitions in a given case are actually pretty reliable, or they're not subject to various order effects or some other type of biasing effect, and that might bolster the case for philosophical expertise with the use of intuitions. And then thirdly, there's probably multiple ways people have carved this up. You could just use this evidence to achieve other sorts of philosophical and empirical aims. And that's typically how I use it. I'm not typically setting out when looking at the experimental philosophical data to support or undermine the evidentiary value of intuitions as a whole, at least not typically. I think you could do that though. So all this is to say, there's a lot of empirical research now that integrates the methods of philosophy and psychology. And I got really, really interested in experimental philosophy, but I also started to have doubts about the degree to which we could solicit philosophical intuitions from non-philosophers. And part of this arose over the course of my studies in metaethics. So it started out, I read this exchange between Stephen Finlay and Richard Joyce, where they're arguing back and forth. And then one of them made this remark, they said something like, it's not as though this is not a quote. This is something I read 10 years ago. I'm like roughly, I wouldn't even call it a paraphrase. Let's call it a almost phrase. I don't know. So they said something like facts about the meaning of moral claims don't turn on what people would say when asked. So like if I went up to a person on the street and I said, hey, when you express a moral utterance, are you asserting a truth apt proposition, which is intended to reflect a stance independent, irreducibly normative moral fact or not? Yes or no, or whatever. The person would be like, I don't know. What are you talking about? Like, they're not going to know what I mean. But if you went up to people, they might respond. If you say, hey, do you think morality is objective, or do you think morality is relative? Someone might go, yeah, I don't think morality is relative. I think that there are these objective moral facts. Oh, someone's going to be able to take that and say, oh, now Lance said morality is objective. I was imitating somebody else. Don't do that. But so whatever, have fun with it. So the point here is that let's say you ask people that, and in this exchange, these two meta-ethicists are arguing back and forth, one defending error theory, one defending what I think is like a speaker relativist position or something like that. It doesn't really matter. The point is that one of them said something like, yeah, what people mean isn't going to turn on what people say if asked. Now, I don't remember exactly what they meant by that, but one thing they could mean is people are not really going to have the kind of introspective access to or reflective capacities to think, like non-philosophers without philosophical training, to think about, when I say murder is wrong, do I mean to express a stance independent moral fact? Now, it could be that if you talk to that person, or maybe they read an SAP entry or something like that, that they'll go, oh yeah, no, that is what I mean. They might be able to do that. Who knows? Or maybe they do think in a particular way. But the point might be just that we should be wary of thinking that what people would say if asked is really reflective of the sort of implicit presuppositions built into the way that speakers of a particular language speak. On the other hand, it could mean something else. They could mean something like facts about the meaning of our sentences don't depend on the communicative intentions of a speaker. In that case, I would disagree because I don't think that makes sense. I don't think sentences mean anything apart from communicative intent. I'm not really sure, but something about that really struck a chord with me. And I started getting into this question of the empirical questions about, well, what do people mean when they make moral claims? And it became apparent to me that it looks to me like a lot of the classical questions in metaethics are empirical questions. They're questions about, error theory, relativism, realism. They typically rely on a semantic claim. And one of those claims, they're not exclusively semantic accounts. They're typically metaphysical accounts. They're accounts about the fundamental nature of morality. But those accounts often have this, to me, strange linkage between the metaphysical thesis, like there are stance-independent moral facts, or there are no stance-independent moral facts, or there are moral facts and they depend on the stances of individuals, or they depend on the stances of cultures, something like that, right? Those are metaphysical claims. They're claims about the nature of moral facts. But typically, all of these theories, all classical metaethical theories that I'm aware of, this includes naturalist realism, non-naturalist realism, error theory, non-cognitivism, and relativism. Those would be like the 5 primary categories. You could throw in constructivism and some other sort of metaethical views. They all seem to be predicated on facts about what the meaning of moral sentences, like a semantic thesis about the meaning of moral claims. And so, for instance, cognitivism would be construed as moral claims are truth apt. Error theory is moral claims purport to describe objective facts, but there are no objective facts of the relevant kind. So all such first order moral claims are false. So relativism is moral facts purport to be implicit indexicals that are relativized to the standards of the speaker or the speaker's culture or whatever. It could be agent, appraiser. There's different types of relativism. Don't need to get into that. So the point is, central to all of these claims is a semantic claim about the meaning of moral claims. Now, the question is, which moral claims? Like, moral claims are not floating in a Platonic void. I don't think moral claims exist. Like, they're not out there. I see moral claims as a type of behavior. They're a thing that people do. It's like jumping, or I don't know, playing chess. Playing chess isn't an abstract concept. It is an activity that people can do or they can not do. We could describe various events as instances of playing chess, but there's no playing chessness floating out in some conceptual space outside of space and time or something like that. So I see moral claims as pretty much the same thing. I don't think there's not a fact about what moral claims mean independent of their usage in a particular linguistic community or in some particular context. That's not what I think, at least. And if someone thinks of language that way, and their philosophical accounts are based on a conception of language, that kind of conception of language, you could say I'm an error theorist about all of those theories, that they rely on presuppositions about the nature of language that I don't think are true. Now, what are actual moral claims? So imagine if I said, here is a moral claim. Murder is wrong. Is that a moral claim? When I ask that question, a lot of people go, yeah, that's a moral claim. Okay, well, who is asserting the claim? In what context is it being asserted? The answer is nobody's asserting it. It's not used in any context. That's not an actual moral claim any more than if I said, if I showed you a picture of a tiger, that would actually be a tiger. It's a representation of actual tigers. Like, an actual tiger is like an actual tiger. Like, if I would have to bring a tiger in the room and point at it, and even then you would actually be looking at an image of a tiger on a screen or something. But like, I'd have to show you a tiger, right? That's a tiger. A picture of a tiger is not a tiger. The sentence "murder is wrong" is not, on my view, not an actual moral sentence, at least in the sense that what I mean by an actual moral sentence. So what is an actual moral sentence? An actual moral sentence is an instance of someone actually using a moral sentence, moral language, to express a moral judgment. So it's an instance in which a person in the real world is actually intending to communicate a moral claim, a moral view, a moral, of course, if I say claim, that might be presupposing cognitivism. But the point would just be like, if we went out and we were actually watching people having conversations, like we went to the grocery store, I went to the mall, or we went to a public event, we saw someone say, you shouldn't do that, that's wrong. That would be a moral claim, not the hypothetical that I just came up with. That's not an actual moral claim. That's like I tend to call them toy sentences, or like toy examples. They're not real moral claims. They're representations of the sorts of things people might say, in the same way that a picture of a tiger is like a representation of what a tiger might look like, or that what they typically look like. So the sentence, like this toy sentence, murder is wrong, when we ask what that sentence means, I think it's literally a meaningless question. It's not being asserted by anybody. So I don't think that sentences have any meaning at all. I think that when a person in the real world, if we found a person saying murder is wrong, there would be a fact about what that person intended to communicate. But there wouldn't be a fact about what the sentence murder is wrong means, independent of that speaker or any other speaker, or communicator of whatever kind. Instead, there would be facts about when people tend to say the sentence, like murder is wrong, there would be facts about the communicative intentions of different speakers. And not every speaker is going to mean the same thing. Sometimes when a person says murder is wrong, in principle, they could be expressing an emotional state. Sometimes they could be making an imperative, like issuing a command to somebody, like don't murder. Sometimes they could be speaking with the intention to express a stance-independent moral claim. Sometimes they could be a relativist. Now, and then it's going to be an empirical question, a question about the psychological states of the speaker. We could say the communicative intent of the speaker that determines what they meant in that instance of them using the sentence, murder is wrong. In other words, questions about the meaning of sentences like murder is wrong are questions about psychology. So that was the view that I increasingly developed. And so when you look at all of these meta-ethical theories, there's, maybe there isn't a true dichotomy, but I see roughly, as far as I can tell, a couple primary options. One of those options is that the semantic thesis that figures into the traditional meta-ethical positions, and we could, we could say moral naturalism, moral non-naturalism, the two main realist positions, and then error theory, relativism, non-cognitivism, the main anti-realist positions. There are other positions. My position isn't any of those. I'm a meta-ethical quietist. I don't fit in any of the categories for precisely the kinds of reasons that I'm talking about now. So those traditional categories, if you look at them, every single one of them is predicated on a semantic thesis about the meaning of moral sentences. But again, what moral sentences? Now, if these are accounts, if these are non-empirical accounts, if they're supposed to be like analytic accounts of like the meaning of these moral sentences, then I think that there is a deeper, there's a presupposition about meaning and language that I don't share. And I don't think these are non-empirical questions. So some philosophers might say none of these theories are empirical theories. Now, I would find that really, really weird. Let's say you're an error theorist. An error theorist, and by the way, if you look at what proponents of these views said, so if you look at what Ayer says or J.L. Mackie, they'll say things like, when people make a moral claim, they mean to say, sure looks like a psychological claim to me. So a lot of the 20th century accounts of moral assertions really look like attempts to describe the communicative intent of speakers. In fact, I should pull up some quotes. And while I do that, I'll also have a look at the chat and start saying hi to people. So give me 1 second. Great. I found one place where there's a few quotes. I'll tell you about that in a second, but let me have a look at the chat first. All right. Let's see where we are at. All right. I got some waves. Hey. Got a hi, Lance. Hello. I got a few other highs. Here's a hi. Here's another one. Here's another one. Hi, everybody. I got whatever this is, meta quietistic quasi-dualismonism. Probably my view. That sounds about right. Yeah. So by the way, this has come up before because I study the psychology of metaethics. And part of what I do with that is I make critiques about the psychology of metaethics. And the psychology of metaethics is often used to make claims about metaethics. And so sometimes in some respects, I think I've heard people say this before, they've called the psychology of metaethics in a certain sense meta-metaethics. And then because I do methodological critiques of the research on the psychology of metaethics, there is a somewhat strained, but still not completely inaccurate sense in which you could say that technically I do metaethics. I at least have fun with that idea. I like getting meta. So I like that I could be triple meta on that. Okay, we got Danny here. Cool. All right, let's see. This looks like it might be related. I haven't even read it yet. Let's find out. When I've critiqued philosophy, people came back with, but people get degrees in it, so it's legit. Yes, this is definitely something that I will be addressing in the future, which is philosophical expertise. I could even address it today if I really get into it. I feel energetic, so I might do that today. All right, I see people saying hi to each other. I'm not going to post those up here. All right. People saying hi to each other. I am glad people here are being friendly and talking to one another. Surely no such study exists where 90% of philosophers are anti-realists. You would be surprised. So you could find, in fact, I will post it right now. It comes pretty darn close. This is a paper. I am posting it in the chat now. This is a paper from Polzler and Wright. I am very familiar with this paper. I've cited it many times and I've read it more than once. It's a very cool paper. It's called Anti-Realist Pluralism, a New Approach to Folk Metaethics. It was published in 2020. So what they do in this paper, I'll stop and give a quick summary of this. So Polzler and Wright have been at the forefront of identifying and correcting for methodological problems with early research in the psychology of metaethics. The psychology of metaethics, one day, I'm planning to do a video on an introduction to the psychology of metaethics. That is my area of specialization. I've never done a video specifically on that. It's a little strange that I haven't done that, but I will. So the psychology of metaethics is basically the study of how non-philosophers think about traditionally metaethical questions. Technically, the psychology of metaethics, it would address any questions within metaethics. Almost all of my focus is on moral realism and anti-realism and the different subcategories that fall within there. But you could also study things like moral internalism and external, like motivational internalism and externalism about moral beliefs. And there is empirical research on that as well. There's not as much of it, but I love the motivational stuff. That stuff is really interesting to me. I never found the time to really totally redirect my focus over to there. I have read a few of those papers and they're cool. So there is other work in the psychology of metaethics, and I actually don't even know enough about it to talk about it. I could just talk about the realism, anti-realism stuff. So early work goes back quite a while, but one really, really pivotal paper in the field is Goodwin Durley's 2008 paper, which really got things going with the employment of the disagreement paradigm. The disagreement paradigm is this method where you present people with a disagreement. In their studies, they did a disagreement between the participant and what they told them was a previous participant, but you could also do, and I call those first personal disagreement paradigms because it's a disagreement between literally you, they ask you, what's your moral position? And then they say, okay, imagine a person disagrees, or here's a person that does disagree. Now, and then you make your judgment about that. Or third personal ones is they tell you about two other people. So folk moral relativism, that paper and a few other papers use third personal versions of the disagreement paradigm. What both of them do is they pit conflicting first order moral beliefs against one another, whether it be yours and another person's or two other people's. So it could be like, for instance, one person says stealing is wrong, one person says stealing is not wrong, or whatever. They use a variety of different moral issues. And then you ask them, do you think that both you and the other person or the other two people could be correct about either their conflicting moral views, or does at least one of them have to be incorrect? If people say they could both be correct, that's typically taken as relativism, or at least as some type of non-objectivism or non-realism about the moral issue in question. And if they say, no, at least one person has to be incorrect, that's taken to be an indication of realism. Some people have interpreted it a little differently than that, but roughly it's taken as a method for distinguishing realists from anti-realists. There are a lot of methodological problems with these sorts of questions. One of them being, one of the central issues being that it's not always the case that when you present people with moral disagreements that they infer or they interpret them to be like conflicts of first order normative standards. Sometimes they'll think something like, oh, well, the two people must be thinking of different scenarios. And so they could both be correct, but that's because one person's correct. Like there are some instances in which stealing is okay, like to save a bunch of people's lives. And there's other instances in which stealing wouldn't be okay, like just for fun or to like do something evil. So sure, both people could be correct about specific types of stealing or specific stealing in different types of contexts. That's not what the question's asking. The question is really implying stealing like as a general principle or stealing in the same way, in the same respects at the same time. And often people just don't interpret it that way. That's what my research shows. So, but there's other sorts of problems. There were some concerns with some of the ways that early questions were framed. In any case, the Pulsler and Wright data, so Pulsler and Wright have both done a few things to address some of the methodological concerns. Pulsler has a big paper that identifies a big list of problems, and then they reiterate those problems at the start of this paper, the various methodological issues with some of the early work. For instance, some of the early work didn't always give people the full range of possible response options that they could express in response to the disagreement paradigm. It often used instructions that could have biased people in particular sorts of ways. Doesn't guarantee that it did. Sometimes people can conflate elements of the questions, which could be exacerbated by wording in the question that's potentially misleading, into thinking that they're being asked a normative question, like about their first order moral beliefs, or they could be construing it as an epistemic question. So there's a variety of methodological concerns. So they do their best in the study to correct for that. So they give people a little bit of priming and training in some of the relevant metaethical concepts. They ask them questions to check whether they understood that training. They give them more detailed vignettes, like more detailed descriptions of the different metaethical positions. And then when they give them the response options, they did their best to make them as clear and comprehensible and as adequate as possible for representing a plausible and broader array of different metaethical positions. Then they tested the same participants using a variety of different metaethical paradigms. So I think there were 6 or 7 in there, and using both abstract questions and concrete questions, different ways of framing the questions. Taken together, in other words, this is a very rigorous, comprehensive, carefully designed study that asked people in a variety of different ways about their metaethical positions. And what they found among the participants that were tested, these were people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is an online survey platform, and college students. I don't remember what university they were at. I think it was in the United States. Those are the two populations that they sampled. So what they found is that about 75% of the participants consistently favored anti-realist positions, at least among those tested populations. Now, Beebe and Sakris have empirical research showing that people around college age, so people in their late teens through their 20s, are more likely to give anti-realist responses to the disagreement paradigm than other age groups. So that the college population that they sampled is probably disproportionately likely relative to the rest of the population of the United States to give the anti-realist responses. And people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, some empirical research evaluating the characteristics of people that tend to use the survey platform shows that they are disproportionately inclined to endorse atheism or agnosticism relative to the rest of the US population. And Goodwin, Darley, and I think some other research, Collier-Spruill, their moral relativism scale. There's a few other papers which show a correlation between religiosity and moral realism, or at least negatively correlated with moral relativism. Unsurprisingly, there's this correlation between religiosity and religiosity and realism, and like the rejection of relativism. And so it wouldn't be surprising if the particular populations that they sampled were disproportionately likely relative to other populations they could have sampled to endorse anti-realist positions. Nevertheless, we do have identifiable instances in which a majority of the respondents consistently favored anti-realism. Now, in the studies, they used some criterion, like out of like however many paradigms, as long as they expressed the same view, the same time, or they only had like one example to the contrary or whatever. They had some specific criteria. It was pretty stringent. It wasn't like really unreasonable. Like if anything more than half of the time, then they were consistent. They didn't do that. It was a reasonable standard of consistency. Yeah, 3/4 of people consistently favored anti-realist positions across the different paradigms. So yeah, actually the empirical research, people are often incredulous or highly skeptical of the empirical research on this, but their findings are pretty consistent with a lot of the earlier work. A lot of the earlier work tends to focus only on concrete questions. So people will be asked about like 10 different moral issues. What you'll tend to find is that people will exhibit they'll give the realist response option for some of them and the anti-realist response option for others. You could interpret that as most people being realists because a realism is, as long as there's one objective moral fact, the more realism is true. But I have a different interpretation of that literature. Basically, I think that a lot of the measures are not valid because I don't think that the participants are interpreting the questions in the way that they're intended. That doesn't mean that the studies aren't well designed. They are. I think that the problems are inherent in the difficulties in understanding the distinction between realism and anti-realism. I think it's a subtle distinction that is not easy to convey to people in a way where they'll go, oh, okay, that's what you intend to ask me. So often I think that a lot of these questions are framed in ways where it's difficult to avoid, as possibly a dozen alternative interpretations. So the questions are just very, very difficult to ask in a way that's not leading, in a way that narrows the possibility space of what's being asked in a way where the majority of participants interpret what they're being asked as intended. I don't know that that means that people would require substantial formal training in philosophy to understand what they're being asked. I suspect it might. You could imagine certain sorts of technical topics. It really, you couldn't readily survey people about them. So you're not going to be able to readily survey people about, I don't know, like Fermat's last theorem or like their views on how to handle general relativity or what they think dark energy is. Like people are just not going to be able to give an informed view on most of these issues because they're technical topics that are studied by like theoretical physicists or cosmologists or something. So a lot of the people just go, I don't know enough about that. So and you can't just be like, oh, well, quantum mechanics just is this view that, or, oh, let me just tell you real quick, here's what general relativity is. Now what's your view about it? No, that's not gonna, like, it might have to take a few classes in like calculus and stuff before they could go, oh, okay, so that's what you're asking. At the very least, whatever response you get is going to be inadequately informed, or at least it's hard to assess. So even if people could understand, how would we verify that they understood the questions without testing them? And how do we test them in the midst of a survey? It's not practical at that point. In any case, so those findings show, a lot of people when they're surveyed do endorse anti-realist positions. So if anyone's curious, I probably mentioned this 1,000 times. They've done a couple surveys. One was in 2009. The other was, I think, I don't remember when they ran the study, but I think the results came out. Well, whatever. It's 2020 Phil Paper survey. So back in 2009, when they surveyed philosophers that responded to the survey, I don't remember the information about who exactly answered how many. I think it was a couple thousand or something. It was a pretty large number of philosophers answered the surveys. Anyway, back in 2009, they got I think 56.4% of philosophers endorsed moral realism. That number bumped up to about 62% in the 2020 version. So it does appear to have gone up a little bit. Who knows if that's a result of surveying different people or whether there's actually like a trend, like an actual causal trend where the number is ticking up. I actually suspect it is. I think it probably actually has increased a little bit. So in any case, and then you have something like about 1/4 of philosophers that were surveyed endorse anti-realism. I think it was like 26%. And then there was a remainder that it was 14%, something like that. I don't know if those numbers add up to 100. And sometimes because of rounding, it'll be like 99 point something, whatever. In any case, 62% endorsed moral realism, about 1/4 endorsed anti-realism, and then the remainder endorsed a variety of like other positions. So some people that are, I don't know, constructivist or pragmatist or whatever, they're not going to think that they fit readily within those two categories. And so they'll pick other, and then some of them would specify some alternative position. In any case, so the majority of the surveyed philosophers endorse moral realism. But the majority of people that have been surveyed at least in the United States, seem to endorse anti-realism, according to the Polzer and Wright study. Taylor Davis also has a study where anti-realist response rates were very high across a variety of concrete moral issues. That study was kind of interesting because the most common response, it wasn't a majority response, so it wasn't over 50% of respondents, but it was the modal response, meaning that like the largest out of the different response options available was a non-cognitivist response option, which I find really interesting because Polzer and Wright have another paper where they argue that although some people may have chosen non-cognitivist response options in their data, they argue that generally speaking, non-philosophers are not inclined to endorse non-cognitivism. So they argue against that, but the Davis paper found non-cognitivism is the modal response. I don't know what to make of that. Their measures are worded differently. They were tested in different populations. So who knows? That's a tough question to address. Why exactly? I would run those surveys. I would run all the paradigms in both populations again and see what happens. Okay, so I haven't even got to the blog post yet. There's just so much to say. So I was going to finish going through this and then tell you about some of the quotes from early philosophers. I lose track of what I'm doing. Okay, so anti-realism is okay. So this is you say here, anti-realism is a very unlikely view for a non-philosopher to have. Yeah, so the empirical evidence doesn't support that claim. So a lot of philosophers, that Neil Sinclair has a paper on the presumptive arguments for moral realism. And you will find many, many statements from moral philosophers saying things like moral realism is the common sense view, or most people are moral realism, or we are inclined to think that they're objective moral facts. There's all sorts of these statements that you'll find through the literature. A lot of that seems to be distinctive of analytic philosophy in the 20th century. I haven't seen a whole lot of earlier work saying the same sorts of things. It may or may not exist. I don't read a whole lot of earlier work in philosophy. Probably should. I just haven't had time. I have had time. What am I talking about? I've totally had time. I just chose to read other stuff. So I don't know. It would be interesting to look. So, and if someone's aware of whether early modern philosophers, commented on this, I would definitely be interested in hearing. But yeah, people tend to say most people are more realist, and there just isn't. This is an empirical question, and so far we've got a few dozen studies now, and there's not a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that that's the case. There has been some cross-cultural research. There's one paper that looked at participants in a few different countries, and they found similarly high rates of anti-realist response options in those places as well. So far, there's just not a lot of empirical evidence that would suggest that anti-realism is a very uncommon view among non-philosophers. In fact, the best available evidence. I don't think most people are anti-realists. If you want to know my view, I favor, you could call it folk metaethical indeterminacy, or metaethical indeterminacy with respect to non-philosophers. I think most non-philosophers don't have metaethical positions at all. And I think when they're given these surveys, they are induced to, or they don't really have the choice of not expressing a philosophical view short of exiting the survey. So if I give you a choice between A and B, and they're both determinate views, and you pick one, it's going to look like you have a determinate view, even if you held no view before you participated in the study. And in fact, it could be that some people actually form the metaethical views because you ask them the question. So maybe you never, you could imagine asking people that have never considered the question, do you think there's life on Mars? And prior to asking them, they may have had no view at all. And it could be that they always had some kind of disposition or an implicit view, and they just never expressed it. They're like, yeah, I do think that. And I kind of always suspected there was life on Mars. Or no, I never thought there was life on Mars. Those are the kind of responses that may be indicative that the person already had the view before you asked them. But it's also possible that they could go, I'm not sure. And then they might think about it and then form a view. I call that spontaneous theorizing. And so what you couldn't conclude from that, what's actually happening is the person doesn't have a view. You ask them the question, they think about it, and then they form a view. And now they have a view. And now by the time they're answering your question, they have a view, but they didn't have a view before you asked the question. I call that spontaneous theorizing. And I think that might be going on in these studies, or that people are choosing response options that don't actually reflect their views, or they're interpreting the questions in ways unrelated to researcher intent. And so while they are expressing response options that have been interpreted or coded as expressions of realism or anti-realism, I think in many cases they're not actual indications of what the participants' beliefs or thinking processes are. And I think collectively, when you combine all of those alternative explanations, I think they do the best job of accounting for the kinds of things we observe in the data. This is definitely something I'll be talking about more. So ultimately, I think that the majority of non-philosophers have no determinate metaethical positions at all. They just don't have positions on the matters. And I think that it's an experimental artifact that they appear to have answers when you ask them. Now, that doesn't mean that I think nobody has ever had metaethical views other than professional philosophers. I think some people do. And so I think it's mostly indeterminacy with a splash of metaethical pluralism, or what Michael Gill calls variability. So I think some people do have views, but there isn't a consistent metaethical view among those who do have determinate views. So these numbers are just for illustrative purposes. I don't actually endorse this, but you could imagine, for instance, I might say something like 90% of people have no determinate view. And then of the remainder, 4 or 5% do have a determinate view, but it's incoherent in accordance with Don Loeb's views. So people simultaneously have commitments both to realist and anti-realist conceptions. And so their positions are determinate, but incoherent. And then out of the remaining 5%, maybe 3% are some type of anti-realist, and then 2% are realist, something like that. The numbers could be different. It could be that like there's enough people that are part of religious communities that are sufficiently discuss moral issues that, maybe people go to a sermon or, something, they read a sacred doctrine and it says moral facts don't depend on the standards of anybody, even God. They are true eternally or whatever. And those people might go, yeah, I think that. And I've always thought that. Sure, of course I think that. That person is a determinate realist, as far as I could tell. Why not? So I'm not saying I think it's impossible for non-philosophers to have determinate meta-ethical positions that roughly accord with those expressed in contemporary analytic philosophy. Some of them probably do. I just don't think it's very many. And so I think indeterminacy probably accounts for the way most people speak and think about morality. Okay, so but the research at present, if you like the first pass of the research would suggest, there is a lot of non-philosophers that appear to be giving anti-realist responses, and taken at face value, that would seem to indicate that it's not a very unlikely view for non-philosophers to have. Thank you for the comment. Okay, let's see. Right. So that's the thing. A lot of people, so you say here, of course, I'm only talking from my own experience, but I haven't conducted any studies. That's the thing. It is surprising. And some people, depending on their experiences, might have very different experiences. If you live in a particular community or you live in a particular place, you've talked to particular sorts of people, you might have the impression most of those people are moral realists, and they might mostly be moral realists there. A lot of college professors seem to report that their students tend to endorse anti-realist positions, but then a lot of them are skeptical of whether those students in question are really committed to anti-realist positions. On the other hand, those are separate claims. Someone could say, yeah, I'm an anti-realist or a relativist or whatever, and then when you press them on the matter, they go, okay, well maybe I'm not, and they change their mind, or you could get them to change their mind. That's expressing two different things. It could be that there's separate questions here. Do most people have realist or anti-realist intuitions, independent of what they ultimately believe or settle on believing on reflection? And then there's a separate question of what they actually believe on reflection. There's actually a third question, which is what would be the best sort of external descriptive account of the commitments implicit in the way that people speak without trying to offer a model of the underlying psychology. I'm not a big fan of those accounts because I don't think it makes sense to talk about, to offer a descriptive account of the meaning of the sentences independent of the psychology of the speakers. I don't think there is a meaning to sentences independent of speakers. Okay, so here's a question. Have there been studies that try to induce intuitions in people? It depends what you mean by that. So it's interesting. In the Goodwin and Darley paper from 2008, let me pull up that study so people can grab it if they want to. I didn't link the or pin the. Let me do that now. Here is a link to. I will pin it. To the anti-realist pluralism paper. So do check that out. It's one of my favorite papers in the psychology of metaethics. So check it out. But let me find the Goodwin and Darley paper that I'm about to mention as well. Let's find that one. Here it is. Oh, that's a weird link. Let me find it. Maybe I'll find it. I'll pull it up on Phil Papers. That might be the easiest way to grab it. Give me 1 second. All right, I have now pinned that one, and that paper is called The Psychology of Metaethics, Exploring Objectivism. And rather than try to recall precisely what it says, why don't I just pull up the paper and see if I could find the remark that they make in here. Wow. So I popped open the paper and it immediately took me to the correct location. That is highly serendipitous. Okay, so let me, at least I think this is the right passage. Now I'm checking. It was not. Okay, so it wasn't serendipitous. Let me see where they say this. There's a particular line that they say. Here, got it. Okay, so here's what Goodwin and Darley say in the 2008 paper, and this is on page 1341. It is possible that the majority of people do not think about metaethics at all. However, we start from the assumption that individuals can be induced to think about metaethics. So right there, I think that answers your questions. I think Goodwin and Darley took themselves in this paper, even if people hadn't thought about metaethics, to be induced to think about metaethics. Note that you even use the language of induce. Let me see if they use the language of intuition throughout the paper much. No, there's some papers in the references that mention intuitions. I don't know that they would describe what they're doing there as soliciting intuitions. The intuition talk is largely a phenomenon distinctive to analytic philosophy and less so in the psychological research. So if you're not already familiar, this use of intuition in philosophy is actually a special case of the term. It's a sort of it's a philosophical term of art that the term is used in distinctive sorts of ways. I emphasize ways because nobody got together and all agreed we're going to use intuition to mean a specific thing. What it does not mean is like a hunch or like the colloquial usages of intuition in non-philosophical everyday discourse. It has a specific range of uses within philosophy. It's actually hard to pin down exactly what people mean by a philosophical intuition. If you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on intuition, it is a great entry, and I do recommend having a look at that. In fact, let me link that. Why not? Intuitions, Stanford Encyclopedia. Let's see what we get. I might as well pass this stuff along. Yeah, it's just that the page is called Intuition. Might as well provide you with a lot of resources because you really shouldn't just be getting my perspective on stuff, and I'm sure people aren't. But if I reference things, I would like for people to be able to check them out on their own time and see what people have said on this topic, or whatever topic I end up talking about. I'm always talking about these empirical studies. You should have a look at the studies, and I would be especially interested if anybody goes and reads the studies and they have any questions or thoughts, or they think that I wildly misinterpreted these studies or whatever criticisms of what I've said about them. I definitely like to hear from you. You could definitely leave a comment. And by the way, I should start saying this, but like, subscribe, do all that stuff. I'd like to grow this channel. I want to see more people in the live stream. I want to see more people engaging with me and joining the live stream. We haven't had a whole lot of people jumping in to talk to me. I know people are busy. I don't know if this is necessarily the best time for people to join. And I should maybe experiment with varying the time and doing this a bit more at other times. Okay. Anyway, so I posted the intuition page, but what you'll find is the first section is called the nature of intuitions, and then you'll see the subsections 1.1, 1.2, intuitions as beliefs, intuitions as dispositions to believe, intuitions as sui generis states. And then, it goes on. I think the next section is propositions, properties, and faculties. I don't remember exactly what they talk about in there, but basically they go through a series of accounts. I think the rough order there is to give increasingly more substantive accounts of intuitions. Like, intuition as belief is a pretty minimal account. And, SEP articles sometimes are more neutral. I think this one raises a bit more concerns with some of these. I don't recall exactly what it says, but intuition is belief. What I suspect is that people just use intuition in a variety of ways. There's actually been some philosophers, Capellan and a few others, that have criticized the alleged degree to which analytic philosophy depends on intuitions. They've actually argued that, at least historically, it doesn't depend on intuitions quite as much as people think it does, perhaps not even at all. That's a whole other metaphilosophical Pandora's box to address. I'm not even going to begin to address that here. If that sounds implausible to you, maybe it is implausible. In any case, intuitions, yeah. So the question you ask is, have studies tried to induce intuitions in people? Yeah, I think they have. I think that's part of what some of them take themselves to be doing. And that remark from Goodwin and Darley, I think, is a pretty good indication of that. Let me give that remark again, just to really allow that to sink in. So here's what they say again. It is possible that the majority of people do not think about metaethics at all. That's what I think. I think most people haven't really thought about metaethics very much. And okay. Anyway, however, we start from the assumption that individuals can be induced to think about metaethics. So that's what they say. And so, yeah, have researchers sought to induce intuitions? I think so. Yeah. So you have something in mind more than framing effects. Yeah. So I maybe you're imagining something more robust than just taking the questions that they ask to induce the intuitions automatically. maybe is something more robust. Pulsar and Wright's study, and I think there's at least one or two other studies that I would put in the same category. I call them training paradigms. And what's different about those studies is they go some way in trying to instruct the participants in developing the relevant kinds of intuitions, or at least understanding the philosophical concepts sufficiently to respond as researchers intend. And so you might think of those as doing more work to actually induce the intuitions in question. My concern isn't merely that that framing effects could bias participants in particular sorts of ways, or, to give responses that give a misleading impression that they think one way rather than another way. My concern is that if they didn't think in any particular way at all, that it's very difficult to generalize from context in which you're actually causing people to form views to how people think outside context in which they were specifically and directly induced to form those views. For instance, if people don't have any determinate metaethical position at all, it could be, I'm not saying it is, but it could be that people's metaethical positions have no meaningful influence on their behavior because of the simple fact that they don't have metaethical positions. Now, if you run a study and you ask people and people break in one or another direction, that could be due to various framing effects. There could be stimulus sampling issues. So it could be that the particular stimuli that you use and then subsequently measure metaethical views might give the impression that people are realists or anti-realists to a particular degree, like a particular proportion goes one way or the other. But it could turn out that if you use different stimuli, that you would get a different proportion. It doesn't necessarily have to be a biasing factor. It depends on precisely how you're framing that or what you mean by that. But in any case, it could be that if you're inducing people to have these beliefs, it would be difficult to then say, well, 80% of people endorse realism or anti-realism or whatever. And once you ask people these questions and then you subsequently measure behavior, there's some predictive information you could obtain based on how they responded. I don't know. I don't know if you could, you might even do studies where you experimentally manipulate the degree to which people endorse realism or anti-realism and then evaluate moral behavior. There's been a few studies that have done that. So you could do something like that and then evaluate its influence on behavior. It'd be very difficult to then generalize from those results to people as a whole, because even if it turned out that causing a person to favor a moral realist or anti-realist position changes their behavior in particular sorts of ways, that doesn't necessarily mean that the ambient or pre-existing degree to which people endorse realism or anti-realism is reflective of similar differences in behavior. Because if people don't have views at all, then that just may or may not. It doesn't seem like it'd make any sense to say that could be the case. So, that would be a potential concern. So, framing effects could be a factor in some of these studies. Yeah, I see moral claims. Lance Bush, The Sixth Sense. Yeah, that's funny. There's probably some joke you could make, more jokes you could make with stuff that I've said. Okay, so here's a comment. I think one other problem is that it's not clear what's even being asked in the method of cases. I think he said, sorry, let me read it verbatim instead of my brain doing something and changing some of the language. Okay. I think one other problem is that it isn't clear what's even being asked in the method of cases. See, I added the word "the." Let me start over. I got to get it right. I think one other problem is that it isn't clear what's even being asked in method of cases. What's having an intuition about a case even supposed to be? My answer is I'm not really sure. So I'll tell you this, and this is going to be probably a pretty controversial claim. I don't really think that there's any such thing as a philosophical intuition. I think it's a kind of a pseudo-psychological state that was invented by philosophers. And I think when philosophers talk about, they say, oh yeah, I have an intuition. Do you have an intuition? I have an intuition. And they'll say, so you're having the same kind of intuition about this as me, right? Oh yeah, totally. I have the intuition that realism is true too. Or I have the intuition that mereological nihilism is ridiculous, or whatever it is that they purport having an intuition about. It might seem like, because they're all using the same language, you could look at cases like Wittgenstein's Beetle Box. It might seem to people like they're reporting the same types of psychological states, and I'm very skeptical that they are. I don't think that there is some distinctive type of psychological state, a philosophical intuition or intellectual seeming. What all of that language looks like to me is it looks like psychological language, but it's speculative psychological language. I don't think that there's been robust empirical work in cognitive psychology to show that intuitions reflect a particular type of psychological state. Now, some philosophers might say, look, I'm not claiming philosophical intuitions are a natural kind. Maybe they break down and they refer to a variety of different types of psychological states. Or they might say, I'm not saying that they reflect a particular type of state at all, natural kind or otherwise, whatever. I don't know what philosophers might say about this sort of thing. They might just think that I'm over psychologizing what they're saying. But if someone's reporting having an intuition, it seems to me like they're reporting. No, I said seems to me. It's a kind of quasi intuition like language. Seems like they're reporting some type of psychological stuff to me. And I don't think that that research on the nature of philosophical intuitions, I don't know that much about it. I should probably know more, but I don't think there's been really good decisive evidence one way or the other about the nature of what's going on here, what they're even talking about. So yeah, I don't know what they're talking about. I suspect it's largely going to be empirically muddled, conceptually confused. There's probably going to be a lot empirically to disentangle here. And I think a lot of philosophers would be disinterested or reluctant to really get into it. And a lot of them might argue that it's not really relevant to what they're doing. And in some cases, they might be right. In a lot of cases, intuition talk might be shorthand for or reducible to non-intuition talk that really wouldn't be psychologically worrisome. So philosophers might just say, look, I'm reporting psychological dispositions to believe certain things in some cases. In other cases, I'm just telling you that I have certain sorts of beliefs, but I don't have introspective access to the mechanisms for why I believe those, or they don't seem to be inferential to me. I'm not explicitly inferring them from any like antecedent principles or whatever. And in those cases, it might just be psychologically not troubling that they're making those sorts of appeals. And they might just say, look, yeah, intuition talk might be loose, it might be sloppy, but yeah, it's referring to this thing, and this thing, each of which individually isn't empirically much of a problem. So there's not really an issue with us talking about intuitions here, other than that linguistically, we might have things a bit muddled and confused. And that might turn out to be true. It might be that there's not really anything conceptually wrong here. If there's not anything conceptually wrong, then I think that that's going to have to trade off against there being something linguistically sloppy. So something's got to give here. There's something troubling about what's being asserted when philosophers appeal to intuitions. Either there's something wrong with the language, like the language needs to be cleaned up because it's referring to a bunch of different things and it's unclear in any given case or in general what philosophers are referring to or talking about when they talk about intuitions. Like either that's got to be true, or there's got to be issues with this underlying psychology, or possibly both. I suspect it is going to be a combination of both. It's an interesting thing about philosophy. I think metaphilosophically, or I should say, instead of just constantly using the term metaphilosophically, methodologically, it's not entirely clear to me. Of course, I'm not an expert on everything metaphilosophy or methodology, not even close. It's not entirely clear to me what philosophers are doing or take themselves to be doing. But what it also appears to be from looking into the matter enough to have read some things on it. I've read some stuff by Williamson, some other people on intuitions and like philosophical methods, that, I don't think philosophers have a good sense of what they're doing or how what they're doing works. So, when philosophers report these intellectual seemings, or they'll say, we immediately apprehend certain sorts of facts. Again, to me, it looks like they're making psychological claims, and either they would concede that they are, in which case I want to know more about the empirical underpinnings of what it is they're claiming. And I don't think they're going to have a very robust or good story to tell, or they're claiming it's not empirical, or they're not talking about psychological stuff, in which case I don't know what they're talking about. And I haven't been able to glean a clear answer from them about what they are doing. It's the same, not the same, but it's similar in some ways to when philosophers say like, error theory or something is not making any empirical claims. Okay, then I don't know what kinds of claims it is making. So, if we went out and we actually empirically studied actual everyday uses of moral language, and we formed a model about the psychological states of what people took themselves to be doing in all those cases, and it turned out, and of course, I don't think this would actually be true, but it turned out 99% of the time, when people said things like murder is wrong or whatever, they were expressing some non-propositional attitude. So they were like saying don't murder or murder boo, or they were making a claim that was true or false relative to, say, let's just go with their standards. So they're some type of relativist or individual subjectivist. If it turned out like if you really talk to people, they were like, they said things like, yeah, look, when I say murder is wrong, I'm just telling you what my standards are. I'm not trying to report or describe some objective facts. Or they're saying, yeah, I was just saying I don't like murder boo. So if it turned out, in other words, as a matter of descriptive fact, the folk metaethical theory, the theory of what non-philosophers took themselves to be doing, 99% of the time had nothing to do with trying to describe stance-independent moral facts. In other words, 99% of the time, when people made moral claims, they intended to and took themselves and thought of themselves as making and explicitly endorsed the theory, like to add up all those things, to be expressing non-propositional states or making relativistic moral claims. It would be really weird to insist as an error theorist, no, but moral claims really are moral claims really are statements about the objective moral facts. More within what moral claims? Because like in practice, 99% of the time, that's not what people are doing or taking themselves to be doing or committed to doing or anything. It's not an accurate description of people's psychology. So you could be an error theorist, even if empirically it turned out almost everybody was not committed in some way to objective moral facts. I think that'd be really weird. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a conditional error theorist. So conditional on people using moral claims to, refer to objective moral properties. And then you could say, conditional on people doing that, then those claims are systematically false, or all the first order claims that you could say something like, all first order moral claims that presuppose the existence of objective moral facts are false because there are no objective moral facts. Nothing wrong with that. But it'd be really weird for an error theorist to be completely unbothered by and disinterested in empirical facts about the communicative intentions of actual speakers of actual moral, like people actually engaging in moral discourse. That'd be really weird. So I take these claims to be empirical. And so again, it's kind of this dichotomy. Either they're not empirical, in which case I think that there are philosophical problems with whatever they're attempting to do instead, or they are making empirical claims, in which case I don't think the empirical evidence is supporting any of the primary metaethical positions. So, realist and error theoretic accounts take people to be attempting to describe objective moral properties. Maybe some naturalists, maybe they wouldn't do that. I don't know. But typically speaking, the semantic thesis there is one in which moral claims are understood to be, in cognitivistic terms, to be propositional. And the particular propositions in question are used to express or to refer to or describe or report about, stance-independent moral facts. They're objective moral facts. I'll use that language interchangeably. I don't feel like sticking to one for today. So that's three of the metaethical positions. And then you've got non-cognitivist accounts, which say that hold that moral claims are non-propositional. And then you got relativistic accounts. And then, throw constructivism in there somewhere. And you have accounts that are going to be kind of hard to define. I prefer the terminology that Richard Joyce uses in the supplemental section, and an old version of that's not even there anymore of the official entry for Stanford Encyclopedia of relation designating accounts. So the terminology I think could be cleaner and more precise. It's not that meta-ethicists haven't convened and settled on any particular type of terminology. Some of them will use terms like absolutism. I tend to use that to mean something else, which means it's like exceptionless moral principles or rules. One second, I'm saying way too much and I need to take a drink. Okay. All right. So I totally lost my train of thought, describing all the different views. So basically, yeah, I think that there's real problems with characterizing what we're even talking about when we talk about intuitions. And I forgot my other train of thought, so I'm going to give up on that. I'm going to get through the last few comments here. Oh, it looks like there's even more comments. Great. And then I wanted to get to the quotes that look like early descriptive metaethical accounts sure do seem to me to be making what look like empirical claims. Okay, so what do you think about semantic externalist theories? Ones that would say that beyond in the head meaning, there's meaning fixed by causal history or deference. Yeah, I just reject those accounts. That's a big discussion to have at some point. So, you have Putnam saying, I always get the quote wrong. Is it meaning ain't just in the head? No, it's not. It's meaning just ain't in the head. That's I think the quote, because it took it to means like meaning ain't just in the head, like it's in the head but also not in the head. But I think it's actually meaning just ain't in the head. Let me actually find that. I always get that quote wrong. Meanings, it's plural actually. Meanings just ain't in the head. So yeah, I think that that's don't accept those accounts at all. So I would be anti-externalist. Depending on what you mean by internalism, I might have issues with that too. I often break with a lot of analytic tradition in rejecting the dichotomies that they put forward. So, or they don't have to be dichotomies, because, take the classic realist, anti-realist positions. I reject all of the standard positions. So, when it comes to a lot of these questions, I think the dichotomies are themselves part of the problem. That's a much bigger issue to get into. Let's see. Also, do you think it's plausible that communicative intent is indeterminate? Yes, I do. So for some questions, I think there's not going to be a determinate answer. So when this person said such and such, did they intend to communicate X or Y? I think a lot of times the answer is they didn't intend to communicate anything in particular with respect to those. Or, there's different types of indeterminacy. Some of them you might call them quasi-indeterminacy. In some cases, it might be an epistemic issue where there's just no way to determine what their communicative intent is. And in other cases, there might just literally be no fact of the matter. Depending on the kind of account you're going with, it could be in some cases that if you're, at least in the case of these externalist accounts, which I don't really accept, but you could sort of like do an internal critique, or at least adopt the point of view for the purposes of seeing where it goes. On some of those accounts, it might be that the publicly available evidence in any given instance exhausts, it's just like super underdetermines which external account would be empirically adequate, such that two or more empirical accounts could be equally explanatorily adequate for accounting for the particular linguistic outputs. And in that case, the matter may be indeterminate in a certain sense. Like we don't have I would prefer to say it's indeterminable, not indeterminate. So it's like an epistemic consideration. It could be that, like, if we, for instance, imagine I find an ancient transcript of a dialogue between two people. And from the dialogue, it looks like both realist and anti-realist accounts could equally accommodate the linguistic outputs. Like they both look like they do a good job of explaining what the people are trying to do with their moral discourse. And we just don't have any further facts that are available to us for determining which of those outputs better describe what those people mean. In that case, it would be indeterminable, even if there were a determinate fact. We just wouldn't know what it was. And then in other cases, it could just be people don't have nothing about what a person is saying indicates a particular position at all. In his paper on indeterminacy and variability in metaethics, Michael Gill gives an example of Platonism and anti-Platonism about mathematics, and says something like, it's just, ordinary language, ordinary mathematical language just isn't in the business of attempting to say things consistent with one or another of these accounts. And I would take in most cases of ordinary usage of mathematical language that they are there's no determinate fact of the matter about whether people intend to, implicitly endorse Platonism or anti-Platonism about mathematics. I think that's just not what mathematical language is typically used for. And it doesn't need to address those sorts of questions. And, a lot of times I think philosophers, and this is a more general issue, I think philosophers, they kind of imagine that, and this might not be entirely fair, and it might not be entirely accurate of all analytic philosophers or philosophers more generally, but I think that there's a degree to, there's some kernel of truth in this, at least. It often looks like philosophers think of themselves as, so to form these philosophical theories, you're in a certain sense trying to refine and vindicate common sense thinking, ordinary thinking, what Sellers might call like the manifest image as opposed to the scientific image. And so what they do is they start with what they take to be central or prototypical cases of a particular type of discourse. It's like the sorts of things non-philosophers say. And that's the grist for the philosophical mill that they then engage in. And their job then is to analyze what they take to be the meaning of these everyday, ordinary sentences. And then by understanding what those sentences mean, we gain insight into these common sense notions about what the world is like. And so we move from an analysis, an interpretation of ordinary sentences or utterances to metaphysical positions about what the world is like. I do think philosophers are doing that, or frequently do that. I don't know how contentious of a claim that is. The problem is I don't think that that's a very reasonable way to go about trying to figure out what the world is like. I don't think most of this analysis is of these toy sentences. So what I think a lot of philosophers do is, if you really wanted to know whether non-philosophers are moral realists or anti-realists, or whether when they make moral claims, they're using them in a way consistent with realism or anti-realism, why wouldn't you go talk to people? Why wouldn't you go study their behavior or gather big corpuses of data, look through archives or conduct psychological research? There's a whole bunch of empirical stuff you could do to analyze what the behavior associated with the language, what people report about what they take themselves to be doing. You don't have to take it to be definitive. Just what would people say if you ask them? Would it not be a mark against moral realism if we went out and we asked people and literally every non-philosopher said, "Oh yeah, I'm totally an anti-realist," or they go, "I don't know what that is," and you explain it to them, and they go, "Oh, realism is ridiculous. Of course, I'm an anti-realist." I don't think that's actually true. I don't think that's what would happen. But what if it did? Would realists go, "That's irrelevant"? I don't think so. I think they go, "Whoa, I had no idea." Most people that don't have training in philosophy, when you describe realism and anti-realism to them, think realism is ridiculous. Or vice versa. They could think anti-realism is absurd. They could have turned out, but the thing is though, if the latter turned out, a lot of philosophers would go, "Well, obviously, of course, we always assumed that was true. It turns out philosophers are great at making assumptions about non-philosophers." So, okay, so the empirical findings are unsurprising when they happen to accord with their presuppositions about some non-empirical claim, or was it empirical claims all along? And when the findings happen to accord with them, they're not surprised because they were making an empirical claim all along. So it's confirming what they already thought. You see what I'm saying? So like, if their presumptions about moral sentences express these moral realist claims are not empirical claims, why wouldn't it be surprising if psychologically people like are non-philosophers are predisposed? You could just say, "Oh, well, we expect it to correlate." Whatever. The point would just be, if the reverse happened, that seems important. Now, it doesn't have to mean that if non-philosophers were all anti-realists or all said they were anti-realists, that anti-realism is true or that this is catastrophic for moral realists. It doesn't have to be any of those, but would it be irrelevant? A lot of philosophy takes as its starting point certain sorts of platitudes or things we take for granted. There seems there's trees, a lot of presuppositions that philosophers, take for granted. And it could turn out some of them are just wrong about what they think non-philosophers think about these sorts of things. It seems like that should be relevant. Okay. Yeah. So then you ask this follow-up question, like if I say dogs are mammals, but I wouldn't be able to explain much about what being a mammal is. So that may or may not be indicative of some type of communicative indeterminacy. You do have this really interesting thing, the illusion of explanatory depth. And so it turns out that people often have a sense that they have an understanding of things. So, so it might seem to me like, I know how watches work. If you asked me to draw a diagram of watches, I couldn't do it, like the interior of a watch. I'm not even sure. Aren't there like different types of watches? Some use gears and like some are digital. I don't know. I'm assuming there aren't all those little fancy gears inside like a modern like an Apple Watch or whatever. I'm assuming not. I'm pretty sure that's not in there. But so in other words, I'm assuming that there's different ways of structuring a watch, and some of them are like have different types of physical components than others. I at least am pretty sure that's true. But the point would be, especially in the case of like digital computers and modern computer stuff, I couldn't tell you how any of that works. But even older watches that are you could say they rely less on like, they're not using like microprocessors and stuff like that. I think there's like gears in there that like turn. I don't know how they work. And so if you ask me how does a watch work, I'm going to tell you I don't know. But if you already ask people if they know how things work, like, do you know how glass is made, or do you know how tires work, or do you know how? I think one I've seen before is like how a plane flies. Like how does it handle wind and stuff? If you ask people like, do you understand it? They might say yeah, and then you ask them to explain it, and then they realize they don't know how to explain it, or they don't explain it very well. And so this is the illusion of explanatory depth. It's the sort of impression or intuitive sense that we have a deeper understanding of the way things work than we actually do. And in a lot of cases, people might have these categories and schema where they don't actually know the underlying principles behind what determines which sorts of things are or are not mammals, for instance. But they still they form associations People could be very good at classifying which things are or are not mammals, even if they couldn't give you like a deep biological account. Like they don't have to say mammals have, are this particular monophyletic clade that arose from, I don't know, some mammal-like reptiles 180 million years ago or whatever. Don't take that as the actual time. I don't know what it is. But the point would be, they don't have to be evolutionary biologists with a deep understanding of the paleobiology of mammalian evolution to identify the precise mammals are all organisms that share a last common ancestor. Suddenly I can't remember the terminology. Whatever. I'm not an evolutionary biologist. So you would have to look at a tree showing the evolution of different organisms and say, boom, anything after this point, anything in these branches, those are mammals. They wouldn't have to be able to do that to effectively identify which things are or not mammals. So does that mean their view on whether things are mammals or not is indeterminate? I would say no. I wouldn't think so. But there's a bunch of questions that raises that I couldn't possibly address all of them. Some of them I wouldn't be able to address, and some of them I think it would take too long to address. A lot of it is probably stuff I couldn't adequately address. I am not a philosopher of language, and I don't study linguistics. I should, but there's too many things to study. Okay. All right, I said so much. All right, let's see. Is Pulsar and Wright study using forced choice design? Yes, they do use a forced choice design. Is this going to be a stream where the viewers can come in? It might have been an hour ago, but at this point, I'm going to get worn out before I'm up for talking to people. So probably not. You wanted to ask some, I see this other post. You wanted to ask some questions about the context of the study. We'll see, depending on how far I get in this, because I didn't even talk about, I guess I don't have to talk about it, because today was generalizing from the armchair, and I have a blog post related to that. I should probably talk about that, because that's the name of the stream. So now at this point, it's been an hour and a half, and anybody getting into here is going to go, none of this has a whole lot to do with, actually, it has enough to do with the topic, but I do want to talk about the blog post and what motivated it. That would probably take me at least a half hour, so then we'd be running up to 2 hours. And I'll keep doing these live streams. And, right now I haven't had too many people come in to join the stream. So I could certainly reserve discussions for another week. And that might give you some time to formulate questions. If you don't mind, if you want to pop in another week, I think that would probably be the best way to do things. And I'd be happy to talk about that study or any other empirical studies in this. Just for the record, just because I'm pretty forgetful. So even though I've read through studies a bunch of times, part of the reason I do that is because I keep forgetting the details. So it's always possible that I've forgotten some of the details. So I might have to look at the paper and reference things in the paper. In any case, I for now, provisionally, I'm going to say, come back and talk to me about that particular paper and pose those questions next week. If you want to pop some in the chat now and get things rolling, I could try to address those today if I've got the time. I'll at least try. And that might be the easiest way to get things started. But I would prefer for you to come into the stream and talk to me, because I think that would be more engaging and dynamic and interesting and probably better for the audience. I'm just a little worried I'm running up against the clock here. Okay, so one problem is that realism versus anti-realism is just not the way that ordinary people think. Well, that's certainly my view on the matter, but I don't know how common my view is. It's probably pretty uncommon. I think my view, is at best controversial. Probably most people don't know about it, and a lot of people I think would think the view is kind of goofy if they knew about it. I'm very self-aware of the fact that my philosophical position on a lot of matters is not super popular. This is a good remark. My mom just thinks philosophy is nonsense. What would she say if she asked this question? I don't know. You could ask her and report back. I'd be curious to find out. The truth is, I think a lot of philosophy is nonsense. And this is something I often talk about people that study philosophy. Is they'll often say, well, most of the people I talk to have this or that intuition, or they'll scoff at the suggestion that a particular philosophical issue is a pseudo problem, or it's predicated on presumptions about language or metaphysics or whatever that are ridiculous or nonsensical or absurd, or at least very implausible. In any case, I think a lot of philosophical, in fact, I would go so far as to say that I think the majority of philosophical problems are pseudo problems, or at least deeply conceptually muddled in the way that they're typically framed, and that the best answers to those questions are not best captured by the typical or the mainstream responses to those answers. Like at best, I'm not saying there are no legitimate philosophical questions. I'm not saying that there's no like philosophical positions that I just straightforwardly think are correct. Insofar as moral anti-realism is the view that there's no sense of independent moral facts, I think that view is correct. So, I'm not totally opposed to endorsing particular philosophical positions, but by and large, I think a lot of it is nonsensical. And what I'd say about that is that I think that there are strong social forces, and you could say there's selective pressure for people with my sort of disposition, which is to be highly critical of the conventional views in philosophy, to leave the field. It's not encouraged to do or think about philosophy when you're kind of a huge party pooper that goes around bumming everybody out. But because, for philosophers, if you're playing a game, it's fun to have a rival with a different strategy, So if you're playing chess, you might want to play not just people that are better than you, but you want to play people that play a fun game. You don't want to play some, every single person is identical in the way that they play. You want to play a dynamic range of players that have different types of strategies. Maybe there's people that play a little more aggressively, a little more defensively, people that are willing to make big sacrifices, people that are a bit more cautious, people that are really good at openings, and people that are, that really use a very preset set of openings. And then it's like mid-game where things start getting more interesting, and other people that are a little more wild and experimental, but still clever with their approaches. When people play chess, they want typically to encounter that dynamism in the range of opposing views. And I think a lot of philosophy is the same way, where philosophers want to encounter philosophers with opposing views because that makes for interesting discussion. You don't just imagine you go to a conference and you say a thing, and then everyone in the audience hears one hand, yes, yeah, I agree with you. And then the next person, yes, Dr. So-and-so, what do you have to say? I also agree with you. The third person, yeah, I agreed with your point, your second point. Another person, I looked at your argument, premise 1, 2, and 3, and your conclusion, I agree with premise 1, I agree with premise 2, and I agree with premise 3. So I accept your conclusion. Imagine that conference. Who's going to go back to that conference? That'd be the most boring conference in the world. You might go there to, flatter your ego and feel great. Everybody agrees with me. Yeah. I think 2 or 3 of those conferences, you would be bored to the point where you'd be incapable of doing the work anymore. You probably go do something else. So philosophers like to disagree, but I see a lot of those disagreements as being, they enjoy the disagreements when they operate within a presuppositional framework that buys into enough of the underlying methodology and presuppositions of philosophy. Like two analytic philosophers that want to duke it out on a philosophical issue, they at least want to agree that like our intuitions are at least some prima facie evidence. They at least want to agree that we can engage in conceptual analysis, and that reflective equilibrium is a worthwhile objective in resolving conflicts in our philosophical views. And then they'll have their opposing views. I'm going to argue for structural realism, and I'm actually a structural realist, but I endorse epistemic structural realism. If you're going to endorse ontic structural realism, then let's have an argument. And I'm a scientific realist that endorses this other view, and let's have an argument about that. And they make those arguments, and they're all operating within the analytic traditions. But you could be a little bit or non-traditional in some of your views or some of your methods and some stuff. But when you are sufficiently not just not traditional, but kind of anti-tradition, when you're critical of the method, like I am, people don't enjoy, at least most of the time in my experience, it could be there's lots of philosophers that say I'd be happy to talk to a pragmatist or somebody that has they don't have a mainstream analytic methodological approach to philosophy. There's probably plenty of people that would want to talk to me. I'd love to meet them. I don't hang out in philosophy departments all day. I would love to. So anyway, there's probably people that would want to talk to me, and people with similar views, and people that have different views than mine, but are still not very standard views. Anyway, the point is, I see a lot of the discussions where if you don't buy into enough of the presuppositions, people are not super excited about talking to you. And maybe that's just, that's not necessarily a problem. It could just be, they're like, look, I like having these kinds of conversations. I don't want to have those kind of conversations. That's fine. But I do think it's often kind of frustrating when you do think a lot of the problems are pseudo problems, because people think that, sometimes people will think, okay, well, then you just don't want to do philosophy. You don't want to play the game we're playing. It's like, we want to play chess. You don't want to play chess. if you go to the chess club and you know, I don't know, you bring Go or something, and you're like, let's play Go. Some people might go, look, I like Go, but I don't want to play that right now. I'm here to play chess. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can play all the chess you want. And so when I show up to the analog to the chess game in analytic philosophy discussion, and I want to say, hey, yeah, I'm not here to argue whether position A or not A or anti-A or whatever. There's always an anti-position. I'm not here to argue for this position or that position. I'm here to say that game you're playing is all conceptually confused and you shouldn't play the game. Imagine going to a chess like club, like it doesn't have to be a tournament because then they could say, get out of here, it's security. Imagine going to a chess club and then just trying to tell people why chess is not the best game to play and they should actually play another game. And you're just like, no, but hear me out though. Here, like, I know you're in the middle of your chess game. Yeah, whatever. The bishop did whatever. But you should really quit chess. Other games are better. Go is better than chess. You should really quit playing chess. At a certain point, people go, hey, thanks for your input, but I'd like to play my game. Please leave me alone. Again, I don't fault philosophers for not wanting to argue with like methodological critics, but I do think the methodological criticisms I have are often pretty good. Of course, I wouldn't make them if I didn't think they were good. And I wish that this was a more popular view. So I think a lot of the stuff is nonsense, but when you get a not necessarily enthusiastic reception, a lot of the places you go, and that's not to say people are rude or mean to me or whatever. It's just, if you don't want to play the game, it's not likely you're going to have a whole bunch of people that hate chess that join the chess club. And so a lot of people like me that are critical of analytic philosophy, it's kind of hard for us to hang in there and continue writing and working on these topics when our perspective is so critical. Now, my perspective is critical because I like what I think philosophy, I like addressing the philosophy the way I address it. And I think that the field could be better if it moved in the direction of my approach. But of course, that would be true of everybody, regardless of their approach. So yeah, I think a lot of people probably do think philosophy is nonsense, and they probably don't. So when you say this earlier comment from you, one problem is realism and anti-realism is just not the way ordinary people think. I agree. And I think ordinary people don't typically think in philosophical terms very much at all. With respect to the standard, like the mainstream dichotomies and distinctions of contemporary analytic philosophy, I think those are largely fairly recent and highly theory-laden and constructed accounts that are not isomorphic with and don't mirror or echo in a very close way the way that non-philosophers are disposed to think. Okay, I see exactly. That is part of what I'm worried about. I think that's a reference to some of these early remarks. Okay, so that if that's the case, then I would definitely be super interested in talking to see what you have to say about that. Okay, so I see this comment. I think the increase in the longitudinal part was smaller. I'm not sure what that was a reference to because that was nearly an hour ago. Am I really an hour behind in comments? Wow. Okay, let's see. What else? Let's see. On a different note, you say you're an illusionist about qualia. Uh-oh, we're changing subjects. I'm going to have to get back to, I still didn't talk about the meta-ethics quotes I was going to talk about. Okay. Today I'm just full of energy. Okay, on a different note, you say you're an illusionist about qualia without getting into the meta-illusionism stuff. This sometimes isn't made super clear, so I wanted to ask, do you deny the reality of something like the movie playing in your head? Oof. It's a tough question. I think the answer would have to be yes. I think it seems like there's a movie playing in our heads, at least to me it does, but there isn't. So it's what Dan Dennett, I think this might be what you're referring to, what Dan Dennett calls the Cartesian theater. I think there's an illusion that there is a Cartesian theater. Yeah. So I don't think that that's what actually is going on. So if you look at Dan Dennett's work, Consciousness Explained, there's some shorter works that recapitulate and refine some of what's articulated there. So Dan Dennett does a lot of work to try to show that a lot of the way that things seem to us phenomenologically, like our visual system, our hearing, the degree to which they appear to us to be integrated and to provide a sort of continuous and unified stream of conscious experience, it's not really that way. To give a really basic and simple example, if you look at some object in the distance, and I ask you, does it seem like your field of view is kind of like if you're looking at a screen on a computer, like it's richly detailed, all the stuff in the periphery is color, like there's color there. It's like, full color vision in the peripheral, like in your peripheral view. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. Okay, so you're focusing on a tree in the distance, and you can see the tree, and you're focusing on a specific point. Let's say you're looking at the tree, the tree trunk. That, in the center, like exactly where you're looking, you might have this very high definition image of like you could see the brown wood of the bark of the tree, right? And your periphery, you see the branches, you see the leaves, you see all these colors, you see maybe the sky, the clouds, some birds, a car going by, all this stuff in your visual field. And if you're asked, does it appear to be richly colored in, that whole field of view, and does it appear to be richly detailed? The whole thing is in high def, I think most people would say, yeah, it seems to be that way, but it isn't. People's color capacity for distinguishing color in their peripheral vision is pretty bad. Their ability we can demonstrate physiologically and empirically that people don't have good high resolution in their peripheral view. And so the way that our vision seems to us isn't the way that it actually is. And the same is true of a lot of our other sensory aspects of our sensory experiences. We don't notice that we have like a part of our vision where there's just an empty spot where you can't see anything. There's other features of our perceptual experiences that are just not the way that we think that they are. Now, does that show that we're not conscious or that qualia don't exist? Of course not. This is used to show that our introspective capacities for identifying features of our phenomenology are not as accurate as we seem to think they are. Things are not as they seem. And that's the sense in which illusionism, purports for things to be an illusion. Things might appear to us to be one way, but they're not really that way. Sometimes people will critique, I think it's a very bad criticism to say illusionism is absurd, because in order for there to be an illusion, there has to be someone to observe the illusion. And I think that's a misunderstanding of the position. I think it could probably be better named than illusionism, because I think that too many people are prone to that interpretation. Anyway, to answer your question, this question, do you deny the reality of something like a movie playing in your head? Yes. Yeah, so on yet another issue, sometimes I worry about these methodological critiques you run, that you might always be able to run a critique like that no matter the study. Now, if you're talking about my claims that people are not interpreting the questions as intended, I do think that that's a legitimate worry. And it is something that I'd be happy to discuss. So one concern might be that if I'm claiming that people don't interpret questions the way that they're intended, that any sort of empirical evidence I attempt to show, it could be really easy to get people to answer questions about how they interpret questions in ways that don't really seem to demonstrate that they understand the questions, even if they do understand the questions. So you have a kind of meta problem here, which is that you can ask someone a question, and then you can ask them a second question that is an attempt to evaluate whether they interpreted the first question in the way that you intended. But you could always ask a third question, which is, well, how do you know they interpreted your question about how they interpreted? How do you know they interpreted your second question about how they interpreted your first question as intended? We'd have to ask a third question to evaluate whether they interpreted the second question as intended. And then, of course, there's this infinite regress of how do we know about that? How do we know about that? How do we know about that? I don't think that, we shouldn't take any of these to be any sort of like deductive or precise logical demonstrations. This stuff is all going to be messy empirical stuff. We're going to have to appeal to some type of abductive inference and inductive inference, as the case may be, depending on the kind of questions we're asking. And so what we're really going to do is have to try to form the best empirical models of how we're handling this data. And that's going to need to bottom out, on my view, in predictions and like practical questions and observations. So that could turn out to be really difficult. So I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but I think that you're going to have a better or worse case in a lot of cases. I don't always think the empirical evidence will turn out to be able to run the kinds of critiques that I run. I should say that I don't take the theoretical critiques to be necessarily definitive all on their own, but in some cases, in some cases, the kinds of methodological critiques I run are basically arguing that a particular measure or a particular way of doing something doesn't even appear to rise to the level of being like a valid looking measure. That doesn't demonstrate that it's not a valid measure, but that's not always the case for other sorts of measures. Other sorts of measures might look face valid. Questions of validity and validation procedures are difficult empirical questions, but they can be resolved. So, for instance, if I'm critiquing the validity of some set of, let's say, a scale designed to assess people's metaethical views, and I say that these 6 items are conceptually unrelated, let's say I make that claim, and then someone runs a study, I don't think if they report a high Cronbach's alpha, that's going to be good evidence to the contrary necessarily, but I mean, it could be. But if they run like factor analysis and they do a really well-designed study and they have a large sample size, and then they're able to run exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis, and they show that the factor structure, everything like loads onto the factor like higher than a 0.8 or something like that, I'm just wrong, probably. Even that, there might be issues because there could be like a really big method factor, and you'd have to do everything like to really sort out what's causing the underlying patterns in people's responses. So even if people tend to respond to a whole bunch of questions in ways that are predictive of one another or seem highly intercorrelated, that doesn't necessarily mean that those questions are measuring what you intend to measure. It might mean that whatever they're picking up on, what it means is the way people respond to some of these questions tells you a lot about how they're responding to other questions, something like that. So we might be able to establish that fact. Does that establish by itself that the set of measures is measuring what we intend for them to measure? No. That turns out to be very, very difficult to demonstrate empirically. I don't necessarily think it's impossible to demonstrate. Often in practice, what you need is a good, I'm not unconvincible that measures can measure what they intend to measure. Often in practice, what you'd want is mutually corroborating measures. So you want converging lines of different types of measures. Ideally, it wouldn't just be like 2 or 3 different Likert scales that are all like 7-point Likert scales that ask questions that ask agree, disagree type questions. What you might want is like 6 different paradigms or something like that. It would be cool to get, for instance, first personal and third personal measures, or you could see if you have models from like cognitive neuroscience where like there's correlates between particular types of brain activity and particular types of moral judgment. So actually, there's a little bit of research on that. So there's all sorts of stuff that you could do, and typically you would want to provide evidence. The best type of evidence in science is going to be evidence that's integrative. The degree to which a particular model or theory sort of becomes intertwined with and embedded in the rest of our observations such that they mutually reinforce one another, that's typically going to be the best kind of evidence. So, if the theory of evolution turned out to be false, it would have to be false for particular kinds of reasons. And, if it turned out to be false, then, everything, all the kinds of evidence are genetic evidence, morphological evidence, evidence like looking at fossils around the world, like why is fossil placement exactly or very close to exactly what we would expect if evolution took place more or less the way that we think that it did. Like you would have all these observations that suddenly wouldn't make any sense if evolution were false. So it's the multiple converging lines of evidence that make the case for evolution as strong as it is. It's one of the strongest cases in all of science because you have all these different converging lines of evidence. And so good evidence of what people think about a particular question is going to take converging lines of evidence. Now, how much evidence we would need, I take to be partially a subjective matter. I don't think it's going to take multiple converging lines from a wide variety of distinct disciplines of evidence to confirm that people generally like eating pizza more than they like eating buckets of mud. I don't think you need to run any studies on that, but one stupid survey of like whoever is good enough for me. Like I don't need a lot of evidence for that. So it's, a lot of these questions are going to be questions that the degree of evidence that we, so to speak, need or will convince us, those facts are largely going to be determined by social and cultural and institutional and psychological forces that have very little to do with the actual strength of the evidence. They're going to have to do in large part with the strength of the evidence relative to how demanding we are about how much evidence we need for the given claim. So it could be that evidence I don't find very convincing is taken to lead most psychologists of meta-ethics to conclude that most people are realists, most people are anti-realists, or have a more complicated picture, like certain populations, most are realists, other populations, most are anti-realists, or maybe in pluralism or whatever. And it could be that much of them are satisfied by that, but I have theoretical grounds for being highly skeptical. And it could be people just don't find those theoretical considerations very compelling from the outset. One way to put it would be that people have very different priors than I do on a particular hypothesis being correct or incorrect. So a lot of this is going to come down in part to subjective factors and Bayesian considerations that aren't reducible to some sort of theory neutral, unbiased assessment of the evidence. I don't even think there is anything like that in practice. So that was a very long answer to that particular question. But yeah, I am very receptive to these sorts of critiques. If I go one level meta deep in the metaception of the methods, I'm certainly willing to go a further one and evaluate my own methods. Yeah, I don't think that the what if questions alone. So, when I look at the empirical evidence exploring how people think about realism and anti-realism, I don't just go, well, what if they didn't interpret the questions as intended? You gather data, you look at the studies. That's what you do. And there's plausible hints of people not interpreting the questions as intended. And one of them would be that when you give people 15 different moral issues, they might pick a realist response for 10 of them and an anti-realist response for 5 of them. What are you supposed to do with that? You could accept at face value that, people are just meta-ethical pluralists. They're realists about some moral issues and not about others. And that's the end of it. Some researchers have endorsed that view. There's a paper by Wright, Grangian, and McWhite where they say, okay, well, what if the issue is that because when researchers give these questions, let's say you give these 15 moral issues to people, you use the disagreement paradigm, and then you see what meta-ethical position people take towards the 15 moral issues. Well, what are you presupposing when you give them those issues? You're presupposing you're categorizing them as moral issues a priori. But what if the participants themselves vary in which sorts of issues they regard as moral issues? And what they're actually realists about all moral issues. It's just they differ in what they consider a moral issue. And so what you could do is ask them, hey, of these 15 issues, which ones do you think are moral issues? Get them, some people pick one set of 10 of them. One person picks all 15. Another person picks numbers 1, 2, 8, 7, 9. They all differ in which issues they consider moral issues or not. Then you exclusively focus on the issues they consider moral issues and then see what's the proportion of realist and anti-realist responses. In principle, you could get 100% realism or 100% anti-realism. That's not what they found in that study. They found that it actually didn't make much of a difference how participants classified the issues, whether they consider them moral or not. They still consistently favored some realist positions and some anti-realist positions. Now, note that study came out, that was, I think, 2013. The Polzer and Wright paper, 2020, came out a whole 7 years later. And that also used the disagreement paradigm, but it also used a set of other paradigms. But they changed the wording, the instructions, the methodology, and they did a few other things. And so the structure of the study changed. And once they did that, I don't remember what the original paper, the 2013 paper, I don't remember who they sampled. But that paper found a shift towards more anti-realism. So at present, it looks like as researchers become, as the methods become more rigorous, the anti-realist rates increase. But who knows? It could be that at the same time, there's an associated shift towards sampling from populations that are more likely to be anti-realists. And so the appearance of increased anti-realism is actually an artifact of, it's sampling differences. It's not actually differences in, like, when the design is improved, you are actually correctly representing a larger proportion of anti-realists. It doesn't strike me as terribly implausible, but I don't know what the answer to that question is. Oh, now I can already tell you. So this is a wonderful question. It's such a good question. What is the relationship between philosophy and science? That's like the work of volumes of books. I would love to bring on some people in the future that specialize in philosophy of science and talk to them about this question. They would give much more insightful and informed answers than I would. But let's look at the other part of this question. As in, does philosophy lay the foundation for science, or does philosophy work within science to clarify certain linguistic confusions? It's too big of a question for me to answer, especially almost 2 hours in. I'm at an hour and 55. Honestly, I would give a very boring answer. I'd say it does a bit of both in the second case. So that's a very cursory and probably very unsatisfying answer. You probably also asked it like an hour. Oh, you did. Yeah, like an hour ago. So sorry, you might not even be here anymore. I think it does a bit of both. I think philosophy should operate in a way that's very integrated with science. Okay, we'll come back and watch the rest later. Yeah, no problem. Do you put much credence in Churchland's eliminativism about propositional attitudes like desires and beliefs? A lot of people might view the position as totally ludicrous and totally implausible. I don't. So I don't know how much credence I'd put in it, but none. I'm pretty sympathetic to eliminativist views in general. I don't identify as or call myself an eliminativist about like desires and beliefs, but I'm fine with that view. Like it's in the vicinity of the sorts of views I'm sympathetic to. One question is yeah, you could find my email if you're trying to contact me. Maybe you could do a viewer stream. I would be happy to do a viewer stream. I should plan on doing one of those. I already planned out a few upcoming streams, so it'll probably be sometime in May. Okay, well, at this point, what I want to talk about would be the entirety of the stream, because you reacted to my initial comments way back at the start. I just got destroyed. Lance making claims about chess players without having studies to back them up. You're right. I talked about chess player preferences, and we don't have any empirical evidence about what kinds of games chess players like to play. So I have been wrecked, and I will never recover. It's true. I just made a bunch of assumptions about how chess players think, and I am not a chess player. So what do I know? I don't even have that evidence to appeal to. This is a comment that's at this point, a callback to something I was talking about earlier. I'm actually outside and happen to be looking at a tree right now. Maybe there's no tree. Who knows? Do you know any good resources to start learning about pragmatism? I've heard you mention it before. I might not be the best person to ask. I'm not like a pragmatics scholar or anything. But yeah, where I have the book here. I do. Okay. Pragmatism from William James. So I tend to be especially favorable towards William James and classical. Oh, I'm not even on the camera. Classical pragmatism. So yeah, check out William James. And the pragmatist who incidentally seems most closely aligned with my methodological approach and my views in general appears to be a largely unknown pragmatist, F.C.S. Schiller. So not a lot of people know about Schiller. Schiller isn't widely discussed. Schiller was a contemporary of James. In fact, I think it's right on the first page. I'm going to check. 1 second. Oh no, some of the pages got folded in the book. I don't like when that happens. Let me check it out. Oh, that's the intro. That's not from James. Let me get to where James is in the book. Mentions Dewey. Yes. The preface to William James's book, Pragmatism. And the name is Pragmatism, a New Name for Some Old Ways of Thinking. You'll notice in one of my posts, it's kind of one of the ideas I talk about a lot is normative entanglement. And my title for the post is a reference to this. It's like normative entanglement, a new name for an old rhetorical trick, something like. I don't even remember the name of my own title, but that's a reference to this, the subtitle of Pragmatism. So anyway, so in Pragmatism, right on the first page of the preface, James says, probably the best statement to begin with, however, are F.C.S. Schiller's in his studies in humanism. So Schiller kind of just uses the term humanism. He seems to use it to basically mean pragmatism. It's called humanism. That could be a little confusing, but you can see right at the start of James says outright, probably the best statements to begin with, however, are Schiller in his studies in humanism. So James himself recommends Schiller right at the beginning of pragmatism as a place to begin with. So I would recommend checking out Schiller. It might be hard to find Schiller's work. You're unlikely to find a lot of like audiobooks. It might be difficult to track down books from Schiller. So Schiller has, what is it called? The Riddle of the Sphinx. He has a particular book. I haven't read enough Schiller. I mostly get snippets from someone else that reads a lot about and talks about Schiller. That is like, hey, check out this thing or that thing. So where are some of these major works? Yeah, Riddles of the Sphinx. I think that's 1891. I have looked a bit into I think formal logic and logic for use. I've just skimmed and looked at little snippets of those, and those look like a lot of fun. So Schiller has some interestingly critical things to say about logic. They're not like logic is bad, but they're concerns with the way that logic is used by philosophers that are really, really cool and insightful. That's later work. I don't know if that would be a good place for you to start. But yeah, check out James's Pragmatism and maybe check out Schiller. I don't know who else to recommend. I wouldn't be the best person to ask about that. I'm sure that various influences on me over the years were influences from people that had pragmatist inclinations, and that ended up shaping me in a way where I have pragmatist inclinations. And I probably already had some pre-existing inclinations before, but I didn't get them from like reading and then like going, pragmatism, that's the view for me. It's really that I kind of over the years inadvertently stumbled into kind of like kind of realizing, I guess my disposition or my inclination on these matters is pragmatist in my leanings. And it's only now that I'm like, so now, studying psychology for all these years and doing all this other stuff, now I got to go back and read what pragmatists have to say, just to see what other people that appear to be thinking about issues in a pretty similar way to me actually think about them. So I am not very well informed about pragmatism. So if you want recommendations, again, Pragmatism from James is like, a go-to book, but there's probably people that would know a bit more. I would look around and see what there is out there. So in light of that, I think it's kind of interesting. Lynn's turned me on to pragmatism, but I also haven't been able to find particularly good resources. So that's generally been an issue for me. I don't find particularly good resources. A lot of what I've read, like if I try to pick up an essay or something, a lot of them don't seem to, they seem to not get to any points that resonate with me, or I find them kind of convoluted or unclear. So a lot of the resources I've found weren't very helpful to me. And that's part of the reason I haven't dug into pragmatism quite as much. There's just too many things that I could potentially look into. I just haven't really looked into it as much as I should. A lot of the pragmatism I'm getting is secondhand from talking to pragmatists, and it's not from reading about it. So I wouldn't be the best resource. I would definitely read what pragmatists have to say. So James Schiller. Right. Okay. So I've been listening to William James's Pragmatism, which is interesting, but yeah, dated. Well, it's definitely dated, but you're not going to get, I don't think, too many contemporary or very recent articulations of classical pragmatist views. There's, different sorts of pragmatist views, arose, and there's, people will often point to Rorty or Peirce or other sorts of people that are pragmatists, or in Peirce's case, pragmaticist, and those, a lot of those positions I don't find resonate with my own views very well. And I always find myself inclined to go back to what James and Schiller, like their framing of things, fits more with my views. So a lot of the pragmatism around today doesn't really deal much in Schiller. Schiller has kind of been cast aside and forgotten, and that's kind of unfortunate. And he seems to have incorporated or brought in a lot of the presuppositions or approaches taken in contemporary analytic philosophy that are precisely the kinds of things that don't fit with my view and that I'm critical of. And so you could kind of call them, in a certain sense, like analytic pragmatist approaches. And I want to move away from operating within the analytic paradigm and operate as much as I can, outside of it. That doesn't mean I'm going to reject everything that it does, a focus on conceptual clarity. I'm on board with that. I'm not going to start, favoring obscurantism for its own sake or anything like that. Okay, here is a question. Do you have any recommendations for metaphilosophy as well? I do. So this is super awesome. I think it's Horwick, Wittgenstein's Metaphilosophy. And, reading this, I'm just like, yeah, that's how I would do things. Yeah. So Horwick takes a particular reading of Wittgenstein that might strike some people as like weird or really implausible or even a bit silly, but basically says, yeah, you can extract something systematic out of Wittgenstein's work. So if you look at a lot of like, philosophical investigation, some of these other things, a lot of his work is written in a kind of hodgepodgey aphoristic style that it's very hard to piece together a systematic. It's not like a lot of contemporary analytic philosophy where a person is like, in this paper, I am going to argue for three things. I'm going to argue for this, I'm going to argue for this, and I'm going to argue for this. First, it's not as systematic. And Horwick is like, yeah, look, you can glean something systematic from Wittgenstein's work, and you can glean a kind of metaphilosophical perspective and kind of stepwise method that can be extracted from Wittgenstein that you can then apply to various philosophical issues and examine them. And I find it pretty compelling, and I find it really pretty cool because this work in particular resonates more with my approach to things than pretty much anything else that I've read. I'm just like, yeah, this is where it's at. And so I've fallen very much in line with like later Wittgenstein and viewing a lot of, it's not surprising because Wittgenstein viewed a lot of philosophical problems as pseudo problems that should be dissolved. You have this view of philosophy as therapy and this like quietistic inclination to dissolve problems by discovering the underlying linguistic and conceptual confusions, underwriting the disposition to think that there was a substantive philosophical problem in the first place. And once you unpack and unwind or untie the knot or, navigate the labyrinth of conceptual and linguistic confusions, when you get to the other side, you realize there was never a problem in the first place. And that is very much in line with my metaphilosophical approach. As I said a couple hours ago now, I think probably most issues in philosophy are pseudo problems or pseudo questions. And that's very much motivated by and is in the spirit of Wittgenstein. I think a lot of these issues are due to, problems of language. So what is that quote? I should really just try to memorize. I don't want to sit there like practicing saying the quotes because it's stupid. And I also, my other metaphilosophical predilections are pretty ahistorical. That doesn't mean that I think the history of philosophy is useless or unimportant. And it doesn't mean that I don't think studying the history of philosophy is deeply enjoyable and often very insightful. I think all of those things. But just my particular questions and approach and the kinds of things I like to do are not very rooted in the history of philosophy, although sometimes you'll find that historical insights from past thinkers are like super relevant or like disturbingly prescient. And you're like, what, they were saying that? Whoa, so, and sometimes they'll just have a cool way of framing or thinking about things that's better than a lot of the modern work. So the historical work is really cool, but it's just not, my approach isn't like, I'm not doing some sort of like exegetical work where I'm like trying to figure out what this or that philosopher thinks. I'm not like trying to figure out, well, what exactly did Hume think about this particular issue? That is an important task. It's not a task I put myself to. I'm not trying to figure out what past thinkers thought. So in that sense, my work happens to be ahistorical. It doesn't mean that I think that all of philosophy should be done ahistorically. I think historical approaches and non-historical approaches should work in tandem. So I'm not always that ecumenical. Sometimes I think certain approaches to philosophy, we just are not ideal and we shouldn't use them. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. But historical stuff. So I tend to be fairly ahistorical, and I also tend to dislike the way that a lot of philosophy education. Like I also have concerns about philosophy pedagogy. I think there's too much focus on canonical or specific thinkers and specific works, and that people this sort of encourages people to think of philosophy like to think, what did this great hero think, or what did that great hero think, or what is, and so this, it encourages a way of sort of steeping our thinking in the way that past thinkers thought, or encouraging us to spend a lot of our time doing exegetical work and trying to figure out what this or that philosopher thought without a clear end in mind. Like there's, of course, it makes perfect sense to think, okay, well, what did Aristotle actually mean when Aristotle wrote this particular thing? Or, what information, how does Hume's views on motivation, are there insights we could gather from that are relevant to modern cognitive science? There's all sorts of sort of practical applications to extracting these insights, and they might be interesting for their own sake. But often, if you just teach people, hey, philosophy is about what Kant thought and about what Descartes thought and what Hume thought, let's all talk about that all day. A lot of people will end up just going, hey, well, I think this thing, that you could kind of, it's like you grab your positions out of this like gift bag that you're given, and you go, well, I'm gonna, or like, that's maybe not the best analogy. The analogy would be that like, when you teach philosophy in this deeply historical way, it almost encourages people to like, it's like it presents them with various like banners or like team jerseys. And yeah, that's a good way to put it. You get all these jerseys. There's the Kant jersey. There's the Bentham and Mill jersey. There's the Aristotle jersey. Which team are you going to fight for? Are you going to fight for deontology, consequentialism, or virtue ethics? Pick a team. And then people end up thinking in terms that might be outdated, or thinking in terms of that where they're just by default, without even reflection, disposed to think exclusively in terms of the historical dichotomies and distinctions and divisions that have characterized historical philosophy without questioning those. And maybe on questioning them, they go, yeah, those are good distinctions, I support them. But you don't want to have such a traditionalistic approach to philosophy that philosophy is treated almost like a religion, where you're like, hey, here's the sacred scriptures, read the scriptures, and because that can constrain the way people think. I also think it could cause people to put far too much weight on particular thinkers when they are idolized, or you could even go so far as to say, in a certain sense, canonized as almost like a philosophical saint. I don't think we should like see every ancient philosopher as some, amazing thinker whose thoughts deserve to be taken very, very seriously just because they're so famous and so influential. It doesn't matter how famous and influential you are. That lends zero weight in and of itself to the strength of the quality of your arguments or the plausibility of your views. It's nothing to do with it. Related to that, so there's an ahistorical element to my approach. I have this attitude towards pedagogy that's likewise both ahistorical, and I would favor de-emphasizing a focus on individuals and to focus more on methodology. So I think when people are teaching philosophy and studying philosophy, they should focus more on the foundations of how to think through philosophical issues effectively. For instance, I think a lot of philosophy training focuses far too much on reading and writing and not enough on discussion. And I think that's to its detriment. Of course, philosophers frequently talk to one another a lot, but you rarely see philosophy courses training people by having them have debates or have discussions and then have the instructor go, hold up, okay, so you asked a question and then they responded, but did you not catch that your question was ambiguous? And oh yeah, I did have a sense it was ambiguous. So we're all on the same page, it was ambiguous. Now, how would you resolve the ambiguity? Like, what are the possible ways you could resolve it? And the person goes, okay, so there's at least 3 plausible ways of interpreting it, A, B, and C. Yes, and which way do you interpret? Oh, I interpret it in way A. Now, you say to the other person, did you mean A? And they go, no, I actually meant B. Aha, so you see, so you were talking past one another. So that kind of dissection of a discussion in real time could yield significant insights into how to have more productive and effective philosophical discussions. And I don't think people get much formal training in that. And I think it would be extremely valuable for them to do so. Part of the problem here is the institutions and the incentive structure that has been built into the way that contemporary philosophy is done at the academic level. You gain status, prestige, and career advancement by publishing papers in peer-reviewed journals. That's how you do it. And so a lot of the focus is shifted towards publishing papers in peer-reviewed journals. Now, if you don't know, the peer review process has been around in full swing for what, 60 years? Like not very long. It's only been around for a few decades. And like peer review only started like to a significant extent, like maybe 100 years ago. I mean, there were earlier times where there was something like peer review. So people would circulate letters or they would publish things where people would solicit writings. But the sort of formal modern peer review process is very, very recent. And so a lot of the way that the current system is structured is very recent, but it effectively rewards people specifically for writing papers. So naturally, a lot of the focus in instruction it centers on and teaches people to write philosophy essays. I've never seen an instance of students being working through how would you write a book. And now maybe it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for an undergraduate or even a graduate student to write a book as an exercise. I mean, it's writing a book. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. That's a lot of work. And so, saying, hey, why don't you write a book over the weekend, of course, isn't feasible. Even giving someone a year to write a book might not be enough. So, but there isn't even a thought process into like, are there courses frequently taught in philosophy? Is it a standard part of philosophical training? How would you write a book? Maybe, I don't know. I certainly didn't take a course like that myself, and I haven't seen one. Maybe they exist. But if they do, I doubt they're super popular and every philosopher has formal trainings precisely in how to write books. No, people are trained how to write essays. They're not trained how to have discussions with other philosophers. They're not trained how to have discussions with scientists or academics working in non-philosophical fields. And they're not trained how to talk to non-philosophers, at least as far as I know, even though all of that would be deeply useful to the discipline to have these sorts of discussions. In fact, most philosophers probably don't have YouTube channels or are not out there discussing their views. So, at a certain point, it's sure going to look like a lot of philosophers are anti-realists, on YouTube, just because I'm making so many videos about the topic. So, you go do a search for moral anti-realism and you're going to get like 30 videos of me. Most philosophers are not anti-realists. They're not pragmatists. They don't endorse my views. I hold, views that are very few philosophers are illusionists about consciousness. At least I don't think it's very many. So I don't have the most common view, but a lot of philosophers aren't making videos, probably because they're working on papers. So I think that's a bad thing. So a lot of the way philosophy is taught and practiced and thought about, I think isn't a good thing. I also think that when people treat ancient philosophers as having, outsized importance or insight, or, they're treated as these grandiose figures, I think that could cause people to put undue weight on their positions and on their arguments. And so I think that there are downstream negative consequences to the current way philosophy is taught and practiced. And I think that they're pretty detrimental to the field. Okay, so let's see what else. So now I'm going on 220. I don't know, I just had so much energy today. So you say problem is analytic philosophy seems to be where the obscurantism is. A lot of the obscurantism is going to be in continental philosophy. It's going to be worse. I think a lot of the obscurantism in analytic philosophy is less obvious, but is also present. So unfortunately, it seems to be just a feature of a lot of the way that contemporary philosophy is done, at least in the analytic and continental areas of philosophy, where it's just a lot of it is pretty obscure. I think a lot of the analytic philosophy hides its obscurity behind formalism. So, it's really common to see in an analytic philosophy paper, someone present their argument in some sort of formal syllogism as if that made it somehow more rigorous or more clear. And often it doesn't, because the syllogisms often compress arguments down in such a way where there's a bunch of implicit there's a bunch of concealed premises or presuppositions that aren't being explicitly stated, or the language ends up becoming ambiguous, or the language ends up allowing for a kind of implicature or insinuation to such that the syllogism might look like it's actually a move away from rhetorical and polemical language towards something more formal, but it actually is serving as a kind of linguistic sieve that's compressing language down in such a way that it's actually amplifying the degree of ambiguity in such a way that it actually makes alternative positions to whatever the person's arguing for look like stupid or morally wrong or something like that. and then it ends up becoming a sort of rhetorical bludgeon. And I actually think formal logic is often used precisely in that way, as a rhetorical bludgeon. It's not helping with clarity. It's actually taking away from clarity in a way that paradoxically or unfortunately looks like it's increasing clarity. So yeah, I think analytic philosophy has not only a problem of obscurantism, but a problem of unseen obscurantism. The obscurantism is masked behind what often on the outside appears to be a greater degree of degree. Okay, I must be getting tired and worn out if I'm messing up words. It's matte. So what I'm saying is, you look at a paper, it looks formal and precise and clear, but when you dig into it, it's not. So a lot of philosophy, you might read some continental philosophy where a lot of it, the language is obscure and overwrought and it's hard to interpret. But when you look at it and you read it, you can read it and go, yeah, this is obscure and overwrought and hard to interpret. But when you look at a lot of analytic philosophy, it superficially looks like it's very clear and precise and formal. So you might have somebody say, in this paper, I'm going to argue for X. My argument for X involves premise 1, premise 2, and a conclusion. Here's what I think about premise 1. And they'll proceed from there. And it looks very formal and precise and quasi-mathematical. And actually, a lot of that is concealing moves that are actually relying on connotation and pragmatics and a kind of masked rhetoric that is hiding behind a degree of unseen obscurantism. And that's a serious issue. And I don't know what to do about it. But that's what a lot of my blog posts are about. That's what a lot of my videos are about. My most recent blog post is talking about precisely that. What's the name of my most recent one? It is called The Fake Cheese Fallacy. And then I go on to talk about pragmatics and the exploitation of deceptive modifiers. So that's my most recent blog post. Do check it out. And pragmatics, by the way, is not pragmatism. Pragmatics is something from language. So it's basically all the stuff that's it's the degree to which it's like the factors related to the context, related to the meaning of language. So it's often distinguished from semantics, but I actually think that there's not really any real distinction between semantics and pragmatics. And so I think because I think the meaning of what people say is conveyed entirely within and is embedded in the context of usage. I think it's like basically pragmatics all the way down. But pragmatics is often the stuff that's it's supposed to be not formally conveyed by the explicit or pragmatic features of the sentence. So if someone says, I'm not going to go to the store, pragmatics might be something like if they said it sarcastically. So like tone or the context in which someone is saying something might allow one to recognize that they mean something different than were they to assert, like grammatically or syntactically, you could say, or like using the exact same words in some different context, they might mean something different. One might think that the semantics captures the meaning of the sentence itself, and then the pragmatics is all the factors related to that differ between the meaning of the two sentences, depending on the context in which they're uttered. But in my case, I think that there's nothing else other than the meaning of the communicative intent of the speaker in a given context. And so what I would say is that I reject there being a semantics pragmatics distinction. Instead, what I would say is that we could draw a better distinction, which is that certain sorts of, certain sentences are going to have typical usages. So there's going to be sort of statistical or empirical facts about, in any given linguistic community, what people typically mean or tend to mean when using a certain sort of sentence. So most of the time, when someone says, let me think of something. I'm trying to think of something that would be a good example. I guess, trying to think. I don't know. Let me go with one that did come to mind. That's a door. So if someone says that's a door, what do you picture? So what I picture is a standard door that you open and close with a doorknob or a door handle. They're typically wood. Maybe they're metal or something else, plastic. that you open and close. But it could be in a particular context if you were there and someone pointed to, it could be an archway that goes into a park and there's nothing to open and close. And they go, yeah, that's the door to the park. You might understand them in that context to be referring to the archway and not technically a wooden apparatus on hinges with a doorknob. And so like typically when we use the word door, we might be referring to like a flat, solid surface on hinges that is used to close off the walls between two or more locations, often an indoor and an outdoor area or two indoor areas. Like that would be like the typical usage of the word door, or to references to doors, but door could also be used in other sorts of ways. That was a weird example, but so that's the example that occurred to me. And I was like, that's a weird example. How come I can't come up with a better example than that? But that's the example I came up with. And so pragmatics would involve this recognition that the context can change or influence the meaning of what's being asserted. But for me, context always fixes the meaning. And then there's just differences between typical and atypical instances of the language. But someone might say, nah, there is a door. There's like semantic content to that, and that sentence means something independent of speaker intent. But I don't think that that's the case. I don't think words and sentences mean things in that way. So I probably have an idiosyncratic conception of language that makes it difficult for me to categorize my own views of things in line with the typical distinctions, because the typical distinctions rely on presuppositions that I don't share. So often it's hard to articulate those sorts of things. Okay, let me have a look and try to catch up on the rest of these comments and see if there's any I want to put. Oh, that's right. And I also, let me put that away. You don't need that. I was still going to read those quotes. I still want to at least read the quotes that I mentioned before. So I'll get to those. Yeah. Okay. I already addressed that question. Okay. Oh, so this question. So what is the problem in the debate between ontic and realism? Oh, that was just an example. Those are just views I'm vaguely familiar with, but not familiar enough to talk about what the difference is. So I don't know. That was just an example. Yeah, I don't know that the people endorsing structural realist positions are intuiting that from the armchair. I don't know that they would say that those positions are intuitive. I agree. Okay. So that wraps that up. And I guess just on the pragmatic semantics distinction, if you want whatever. I don't need to say more about that. Like, why do I have to stop and talk about pragmatics? I'll talk about it some other time. I don't want people to mix up, because I talked about pragmatism and then I mentioned pragmatics in an example, and then I'm like, crap, people are going to think that these are the same thing. So pragmatics and pragmatism are not the same thing. So pragmatism is this view within philosophy that, again, I'm not even going to get into defining it, but it's like a particular approach and perspective in philosophy. A lot of it has to do like with a reconstrual or a construal of truth. Like there's pragmatic views on truth that construe truth as like you could say what's useful, but that's very, very misleading, because a lot of times people interpret that as pragmatism is like whatever's expedient for you to believe that is like literally true in pragmatism. That's absurd. So pragmatism is absurd. The view is a lot more sophisticated than that. So that is this particular philosophical perspective. And then pragmatics just happens to overlap in the terminology, but it means something very different, comes out of linguistics, and it refers to, I guess you could say something like the degree to which conceptual considerations contribute to determining the meaning of like a verbal, it doesn't have to play to verbal, so like utterances in written language. So like language. So it's the role context plays in influencing the meaning of linguistic acts, something like that, or speech acts in written language. I'm losing my ability to speak and think. I'm getting worn out here because I just keep going. So don't see those two as the same thing. And then give me one more second, because I I have like a million windows open, and then I have the PDF somewhere where I was going to talk about those quotes, and I really need to find it. So give me. Oh, okay. It was right there. And it's on this screen. Let me bring it over. All right. So what I wanted to talk about is this particular paper. I'll read it over here so I could still see the chat and see stuff pop up. There's this paper was published in Philosophical Issues back in 2009 from Walter Stennett Armstrong called Mixed Up Metaethics. And this view, one second, I got to find the right. All right. Okay, I'm gonna have to close up things after this. I'm zoning out. All right. I've been on 4-hour streams. How come I can't do 2.5 hours? I guess because I'm talking to other people, so I at least get mental breaks. Okay, let me chill for a second. All right. So, and I think I got caught up with all the comments. Yeah, it does look like I did. All right. So, if you look at this paper, actually, let me try to find. Okay, give me one more second. I'm going to try to find the paper so I could link it and pin. All right, I got it. There it is. Is that the right link? Oh, yeah. All right, let me see if I can pin that. Yep. So you could check that out. I didn't find it on Phil Papers. I should probably dig that up. But in any case, Google around. You should be able to find it on Phil Papers or somewhere. It's a really cool paper. And it's a response to actually this work from Michael Gill and some other people talking about indeterminacy and variability in metaethics. Is it a direct response to Gill? I think it is. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that you could get some glimpses of the sorts of things that I'm saying about the way that people frame and discuss metaethics in contemporary metaethics, like contemporary analytic metaethics. And so you see right at the outset of the paper, it's just like a sentence or two, and then it gets right into the standard debate. Now check out what Senator Armstrong says. Moral realists and expressivists claim a bundle of theses on many levels. In particular, the complete package for moral realism contains at least these 5 theses. First, a metaphysical thesis. There are some objective moral facts. Second, a semantic thesis. Moral statements are true if and only if they correspond to objective moral facts. Then there's an alethic thesis. Some positive moral statements are true. Then there is an epistemic thesis, which is that we can and often do know some objective moral facts. And then finally, a pragmatic thesis, which is that moral statements try to describe objective moral facts. Now, note the use of pragmatic there. Presumably, that's meant more in the sense of the linguistic conception of pragmatics, and is something to do with like speaker intent or the context of usage of moral claims, not with pragmatism. At least that's what I think. At this point, I don't even know anymore because I got my own mind tangled up. But notice that this is, moral realism contains at least these 5 theses. That's a very robust conception of realism. I don't think most people would share the view that it is at least those views. I take moral realism just to be the view that there are stance-independent moral facts. I don't think it requires an epistemic or a pragmatic thesis. I don't think it requires. I don't even think it requires a semantic thesis. There is a paper from Kahan that argues against the idea that moral realism contains a semantic thesis. But notice that this characterization of realism has a semantic thesis. And let's read it again. Semantic thesis. Moral statements are true if and only if they correspond to objective moral facts. So in part, moral realism isn't merely like an ontological claim. It's not simply the claim that there are stance-independent moral facts. It's the claim that moral statements are true if and only if they correspond to these moral facts. So it's not just a claim about the nature of moral facts, it also incorporates a claim about what moral language, like what people are doing when they make moral claims, or at least what moral claims mean, or in this case, both, insofar as there's a distinction between the two. And then look at the characterization of expressivism that immediately follows. I'll just focus on the semantic thesis. This is the second one. Semantic thesis: moral statements are not apt for truth by virtue of their correspondence to objective moral facts. So note in that case that there's a claim about what moral statements, like the meaning of moral statements, which moral statements. Now, there's another interesting remark here. So actually, I'll read a few of these remarks. So here's one remark. It is crucial here to ask, are realism and expressivism supposed to apply to all moral language? Some expressivists set up artificial languages and try to show how we can accomplish with words that conform to let me start that over. Some expressivists set up artificial languages and try to show how much we can accomplish with words that conform to their language. However, a moral realist can then respond that even if such artificial language could work, it is not how our natural language actually does work. So I think that the debate has to be about natural language. What's natural language? This is actual language people use, presumably. Is it not? So it looks like this is about not the language of non-philosophers. There's a few other remarks, but there's this particular remark. It's on page 237. There's a couple paragraphs here. Look at this, and then I'll get to the quotes, and then I'm just going to have to close things out because I'm slowing down and I'm not able to think super clear, and I gotta get going. Okay, so here they are, and this is page 320 or 237, the second paragraph. Finally, I need to clarify the purpose of realism and expressivism. Some meta-ethicists try to reform or regularize moral language, or even to prescribe a new way to talk. And then Senator Armstrong cites Brandt in 1979. I'm not familiar with what that is. Just mentioning that. Anyway, so again, some meta-ethicists try to reform or regularize moral language, or even prescribe a new way to talk. This enterprise can be useful. However, the central goal for most realists and expressivists is only to describe actual human thought and talk. Now, ask yourself, is the question of the description of actual human thought and talk an empirical enterprise or not? I think it would be very weird to say that it's not, but have a look at this next paragraph. There are two ways to describe moral language. An internal project seeks to capture the psychological processes or representations that actually occur when people use moral language. However, contemporary realists and expressivists are not trying to do that. When Jackson and Petit use networks of truisms, or when Gibbard cites hyperstates, they surely know that these are theoretical constructions that do not reflect. I misquoted that. I'm getting real tired. Let me start it over. There are two ways to describe moral language. An internal project seeks to capture the psychological processes or representations that actually occur when people use moral language. However, contemporary realists and expressivists are not trying to do that. When Jackson and Petit use networks of truisms, or when Gibbard cites hyperstates, they surely know that these theoretical constructions do not reflect actual psychological entities or events. Instead, they want their theories to be externally adequate in capturing the outputs of our linguistic systems without necessarily reflecting the internal workings of that system. In this respect, their project is more like Chomsky's grammar, which uses constructs without claiming psychological reality then. Overall, then, I take moral realism and expressivism to be trying to externally describe the semantics of all standard moral language. At least that is the debate I want to discuss. What the hell? What the hell? So they want to describe actual human thought and talk, but they have no interest in capturing actual psychological states, and they make no claim of psychological reality. Then what the hell are they doing? So overall, then, I take moral realism and expressivism to be to externally describe the semantics of all standard moral language. I don't think there are external descriptions of the semantics of standard moral language. I don't think that's a thing. That isn't a thing. What is that? So an external description. external to the psychologies. So what are we describing? So here we're told, so if you look at like what Gibbard says about hyperstates, this is like what a person would think under these certain ideal conditions. Well, who gives a shit what a person would think under certain ideal conditions? I care what they actually think. I thought that's what we're trying to characterize. If I want to know, is this person a realist? I don't care what they would think in like what some hypothetical person would think in a hyperstate. I care what this person thinks in an actual state. How about studying actual states? So from this description, so like it's likened to Chomskyan grammar, which using constructs without claiming psychological reality. Well, I reject Chomsky's approach to language. I don't endorse that view of the way that language works. And so I see one person here saying, I get what they mean. So perhaps we should have a discussion about that at some other time. Insofar as I get what they mean, I don't think that there is anything like that. And I think that that's a completely useless waste of time. I am interested in the actual psychological states of actual people, because I don't think that there's any other actual phenomena with respect to language and meaning apart from that. I just think communicative intent exhausts linguistic meaning. And so in that sense, as far as I could tell from the way that they're describing semantics here, I literally don't even believe anything like that exists. So it's entirely possible that I have a view that many analytic philosophers would regard as completely outlandish. But the point is that, like, even if I'm wrong, I don't currently endorse that conception of language and could not find myself engaged in that kind of project. So at the very least, it would be weird. And this is why I object to Mike Humer saying, you only have these 5 possible positions in metaethics. You got to be some type of naturalist or non-naturalist realist, or you have to endorse error theory, non-cognitivism, or relativism, and probably depending on the way those are construed, constructivism will get thrown in there, maybe with relativism, I don't know, mind-dependent views, something like that. So I reject that, because I think that like what a quintotomy, it's like there's like exactly 5 views. That view that there's exactly these 5 views, I think, is based on this notion of like what moral claims mean. And my suspicion is that what's underwriting that is this goal of offering these externally adequate accounts of the semantics of moral language. But since I don't think there is anything like that, I think there only is an internal project that can be done. I don't think any of the positions make it. So, like, in other words, if I don't endorse any of the realist positions, of course, I'm an anti-realist. But if error theory, relativism, and non-cognitivism are all underwritten by a conception of language where they're all saying the externally adequate account of moral statements, these toy sentences that are not even actual sentences anyone's actually using, and has nothing to do with actual human psychology, if the meaning of those sentences fits with uniformly fits with one of these 3 accounts. Well, if I reject that there even is such a thing as these types of moral statements that there is a possible semantic analysis that reveals the meaning of the sentences, then I couldn't possibly endorse any of the positions, because they rely on presuppositions about the way language works that I reject. And so now what is my position? So basically, I just reject any conception of the characterization of the possible metaethical positions that requires one to buy in to particular conceptions of the philosophy of language. We're not logically obliged to accept those conceptions of language. So again, there's a dichotomy here. If it's the case that these presuppositions are implicit in Humer and other people's characterization of the possible positions, then it would only be true that conditional on accepting those presuppositions, those are the only possible positions, but you could just reject the presuppositions. And alternatively, if those presuppositions aren't implicit, it's not clear why those positions would be logically mutually exhaustive and incompatible with one another. Okay. So now I just want to close out by discussing these quotes. And I'm not going to address fully right now why I don't think that those cases, that approach to language makes a whole lot of sense. I'm almost on 3 hours and I do have to go soon, but I'd be happy to address that in the future. It's another sort of thing where I'd love to address it, and I'm too tired. I probably should have already wrapped it up. Okay, so here we have some quotes from the Senate Armstrong paper, and this is moving down towards the bottom of page 237. Here's from A.J. Ayer. Ayer, from some work from 1935. I don't know, something on logical positivism probably. Okay. In every case in which one would commonly be said to be making an ethical judgment, the function of the relevant ethical word is purely emotive. Now, here's what's interesting. Synod Armstrong seems to be taking these remarks to be conveyed in terms of the external accounts, not the internal project, like the external project in particular, not the internal project, because apparently descriptive metaethics is about the external project and not the internal one. So Synod Armstrong might regard these as attempts to engage in the external project. For me, I don't think it's so clear, and I think it's weird to think of these remarks that way when you see the full context of at least some of the remarks, where they sure look like they're making psychological claims. So here's one of those claims. In every case in which one would commonly be said to be making an ethical judgment, the function of the relevant ethical word is purely emotive. So that I find a little bit strange, because here we have ethical judgment, which looks like a psychological event. It doesn't look like a sentence isolated from a particular context. And then we have the function of the relevant ethical word is purely emotive. Well, how can the function, like, what does it mean to say the function is emotive? I mean, aren't emotions psychological states? Why would people be expressing psychological states, but the psychological states expressed have nothing to do with the meaning of the sentence? It's very strange if there's nothing psychological going on here. At least, again, maybe I'm just not understanding the philosophical presuppositions or conception of language underwriting these approaches. It's certainly possible. There's a few others, but I'll pick and choose which ones I think are most illustrative of this. Yeah, okay, so this one might fall more in line with the external project. This is Blackburn, 1984. The point of expressive theories is to avoid the metaphysical and epistemological commitments and problems which realist theories of ethics are supposed to bring with them. So I don't know what to make of that. Here's from Gibbard, 2003. With normative language, we do mix plan with fact. On this point, I insist. An everyday normative term, though, may not express a plan-laden concept at all straightforwardly. So it'd be a little weird to say that there's nothing psychological about these counts. They're not intended to capture any type of psychological reality, but we mix plans with the facts, and an everyday normative term may not express a plan-laden concept. So people are expressing plans and plan-laden concepts, but there's nothing psychological going on here. Okay, that's strange. So this one, again, it's too unclear to know whether this looks like more like an internal or external project, or whether that internal-external distinction just doesn't make a lot of sense. This is from Timmins, 1999. Moral statements in their primary role are not assertions of a descriptive kind, rather they are evaluative assertions. I don't know how to interpret that in line with either of those. So here you have Brink, 1989. Non-cognitivists seem unable to capture the actual content of our moral judgments. Now, try interpreting a reference to the actual content of our moral judgments as a non-psychological claim. The actual content. That looks like the internal project. Is that an external project? In other words, is this a project that has no intention of capturing any type of psychological reality, but it's about capturing the actual content of our moral judgment? So the actual content of our moral judgments has nothing to do with the psychological content of those judgments? What the hell is the content then, if it's not psychological? What is it? I don't know how to make sense of that unless there's at least something psychological going on here. So, and then this one. This is the one that I really had in mind when I decided to start listing these examples. Take a look at this one. Smith, 1994. Here's a quote. We seem to think moral questions have correct answers, that the correct answers are made correct by objective moral facts. Look at that first part. Let me read it for you. We seem to think moral questions have correct answers. That's not a psychological claim. We seem to think. The word think isn't capturing something about human psychology. So if I said people think that, now imagine me going, no, look, hey, when I say people think a certain way, I'm not talking about the psychological states like their thoughts. I'm offering an externally adequate account of their linguistic outputs. It has nothing to do with their actual psychological states. So when I say everybody thinks this way, I'm making no claims about psychological reality. Okay, even if that's true, that's an absurdly misleading way to talk. At best, that's unbelievably misleading. Recall the comment from one of the commenters earlier on obscurantism. That's not obscurantism. That's actively misleading. That's ridiculous. We seem to think moral questions have correct answers. That's a psychological claim. And who the heck is we? Who is we? This is exactly what the title of this whole thing was about, generalizing from the armchair. So moral philosophers will routinely say things like, people are moral realists, without any evidence of this, or very little. I shouldn't say without any evidence. I said the thing, not without any evidence. So it's common in apologetic circles to criticize atheists who say there's no evidence of God. I often take this response, interpreting this as super literally, is like literally there isn't anything anyone has ever said that raises the probability of the existence of God by even a millionth of a billionth of a trillionth of a percent. I don't think that that's a charitable or reasonable interpretation of what people mean. If it is, then those people are wrong. I take a pretty Bayesian approach to these sorts of things. Even the fact that people believe in God is some minimal evidence of the existence of God. So it's not that people that say people are moral realists have no evidence. They can say, well, I'm a moral realist. That's some evidence people are moral realists. I asked a bunch of people and they said they were moral realists. That's evidence that people are moral realists. What I should say is there's no good evidence that people are moral realists. There's no compelling empirical evidence. There's no substantial body of empirical cross-cultural surveys that have canvassed the views using validated measures of people's meta-ethical views across 100 different societies that have all established that the majority of those people are moral realists. There's nothing like that. That's what we could say. And we could say that with an enormous degree of confidence. There isn't research like that. That doesn't exist. There is no good evidence that most people in the world are moral realists. There just isn't. Okay, but look at that. We seem to think. Somehow that's not psychological, apparently. Okay, now take this other one. This is the other one that I had in mind from Mackey from 1977. So this is, I think, the book that's introduced error theory. Okay, so the ordinary user of moral language means to say something about whatever it is he characterizes morally, for example, a possible action as it is in itself or would be if it were realized, and not about or even simply expressive of his or anyone else's relation to it. So sorry, that was a long, weird sentence with a million commas. So let me just focus on that first part. The ordinary user of moral language means to say. So how would that not be an internal characterization? Because it's not saying when the ordinary person says this moral thing, this is an account of what they say means. If you were trying to describe the meaning of the sentence and not the psychological states of the speaker, like the communicative intent of the speaker, why would you say what the ordinary user of moral language means to say? That is phrased precisely in the way that one would use language to convey the communicative intentions of the speaker. In other words, the psychological states, the intentions of the speaker. That's what that language looks like. So either, despite all appearances to the contrary, that's not actually what was meant, or that's actually what was meant. And these philosophers are making empirical claims about the communicative intent of speakers. I think the second is the more plausible. I think these are empirical claims, and I think they're false. Or at least people look, so Mackey, 1977, the ordinary user of moral language means to say something, and then goes on to describe people as being objectivists. Was there empirical, does the book that this comes from, I think it comes from the book on this. Does it cite any empirical research? I don't recall. I don't know, but it certainly not. Most of the research that has been done hadn't been done at the time, so it couldn't have cited any of the modern research. And the modern research isn't sufficient to decisively resolve the matter, and to the extent that we have evidence, it doesn't support the claim. So what is this based on? It's certainly not any good body of empirical data, if there's any empirical data at all. It is a speculative armchair assertion about how people think. That's what I take it to be. So if it's not, I think it's probably nonsense or incoherent. And if it is, it's false, or at least totally unsupported by available empirical data. It's lose-lose for these sorts of claims. Okay, that was all the quotes. So I am exhausted at this point. I'm going to wrap it up there. I didn't get to talk about the blog post that goes with this. So I'll probably have to do something else to talk about that. I went for a long time today. Okay, so thanks everybody for being here. I see this last question. Do I have an argument to the effect that those things that you reject really don't exist? Probably a few arguments. I don't know that I would be able to give you some sort of straightforward, simple syllogism. Certainly not one that anybody would find satisfactory. The case would be one that would be more piecemeal and abductive and rely a lot on discussing like what is the best account of what the world is like. And so basically what I would end up appealing to would be an abductive argument, which is that there are no sets of observations that we can all mutually agree upon for which the best explanation is that these external accounts are accounting for something, some set of observations. Now, people that are proposing these accounts might be relying on a prioristic modes of philosophical inquiry where they just reject, like my claim there is presuming empiricism, and I'm well aware of that. So they might just say, I'm not an empiricist. I'm not going to buy into that. So I think we could use a priori reasoning and we could come up with these theories about concepts, and theories can be correct about these a priori facts. I don't buy into that. So I mean, what this would take would be a sort of full-fledged argument for empiricism, against like rationalists and that sort of thing. And that's like heavy duty. That's like books and books and career spanning discussions that you could make some preliminary and skirmishing sort of remarks about that sort of thing. But it's not the sort of thing I could adequately address in a single discussion, even a 3-hour stream. I couldn't even begin to address that adequately. So take my argument to be the content of this entire channel. And hopefully you'll find something in there at least interesting and worth engaging with, even if you don't find it convincing. But yeah, it's a fantastic question. I'm sorry I can't adequately address that now. And if you want to take that to be, yeah, you don't have any arguments, so you're not justified in thinking that, that's fine if anybody hearing this is inclined to think that. I don't think I've got the answers for everything. I don't think I've got conclusive reasons for why I think what I do. Ultimately, I have certain sorts of inclinations that other people don't have. And we're going to come down on different sides of philosophical issues in a way where we might never be able to adequately satisfy one another or convince one another. It would be great if I convince some people. And if I don't, I don't. And hey, at the very least, if I can't convince people, my consolation prize is that I could have some interesting discussions with people with different views. All right. But thank you for that question. And thanks everybody else for saying thanks and saying bye. I am exhausted. I am going to head out. Thanks everybody for being here. And I will see you next week. Take care.